Deep in the jungles of Koth, there was a large, circular hole in the ground that led to a narrow vertical shaft and a pool of greenish water at the bottom. Although the place was quite beautiful, very few people could come here to admire it. It was, after all, absolutely teeming with chameleon drakes. Naturally, this was the cenote where they had recovered the orb of the first emperors in the previous restart. Zack and Zorian stood on the edge of the cenote, observing the chameleon drakes milling around the place and discussing how to go about recovering the orb this time around. Occasionally a group of chameleon drakes wandered past them or scrutinized their location, but between their cloaking spells and Zorian's ability to reach into their minds and edit their senses and memories, there was little chance of them being discovered. "So how are we doing this?" Zack asked. "Do you think you can sneak us in?" Zorian stared at the cenote for a second before shaking his head. The drakes inside the cenote tended to clump together in groups of 5 or more, and the orb cave seemed to be the place that held the largest group. "It's hard enough to keep the drakes from noticing us when it's just 1 or 2, Zorian said sadly. "Those 4 independently moving eyes make their senses quite unlike humans. Figuring out how to fool their senses from moment to moment is too tiresome for me to do it on large groups." Zack didn't seem surprised by this. He seemed to be getting more familiar with the limitations of Zorian's mind magic. "Then we should just go in, spells blazing, then," he offered. "I mean, why complicate things? We can take them, I'm sure of it." "I'd rather not fight a swarm of chameleon drakes today," Zorian said. "How about this? You move back from the cenote a little and attack them. If their previous reaction is any indication, they should all swarm out to deal with you. When they do, I will teleport into the orb cave, claim it, then teleport out. Even if they leave behind a few guards, these will be no match for me." "And what if your attempts to claim the orb cause the Hydra to appear?" Zack said with a frown. "I don't want to be mean, but your fighting skills." "I'm no match for that thing, I know," Zorian said, nodding. "I don't have to actually fight it, though. I can always just flee if it appears. I'm good enough to survive its assault for the few seconds it takes to cast the teleport spell. Besides, I suspect the Hydra can't actually exit the pocket dimension inside the orb cave itself. It's just too big. The last time it emerged from the lake at the bottom of the cenote, and I suspect this time it will be no different. But if you snatch the orb and leave the cave, won't the Hydra have plenty of space near you to teleport itself in?" Zack asked. Ah damn. He hadn't thought of that. And even if the Hydra doesn't react immediately, simply having it inside makes the orb into a massive time bomb. The monster can clearly exit the orb whenever it wishes. What if we bring the orb to Scioria and the Hydra decides to enter the city while we're sleeping or otherwise distracted? Imagine the damage it could do. If it decides not to react when we claim the orb, it might be a good idea to deliberately lure it out before we bring the orb to a populated area. They decided to try Zorian's idea anyway. The execution turned out to be a little more complicated than Zorian had thought it would be. Apparently Zack alone was not threatening enough to whip the entire group of chameleon drakes into a frenzy and make them leave their lair. After all, he was just one man. He might have been ungodly powerful, but that wasn't something that could be gleaned at first sight. Thus, the drakes initially simply sent a group of 5 young drakes to deal with him. Of course, when Zack effortlessly slaughtered those 5, the entire cenote grew more agitated but not agitated enough to rush out and swarm him. They felt pretty safe in their cenote base, so they just massed themselves together and decided to wait and see if Zack would actually dare attack them in their home. Inconveniently for Zorian, they picked the orb cave as their rallying point. Thankfully, when Zack started to launch artillery spells at the cenote, they decided they couldn't afford to turtle up like that. They rushed out to try and stop him, leaving only a handful of guards behind. Zorian quickly teleported in, claimed the orb and teleported out. Mission accomplished. As for the Hydra, it never showed up. Not when Zorian claimed the orb, and not when Zack and Zorian waited for several hours in the middle of the jungle to see if it would eventually decide to emerge. Zorian didn't know what to think about that. On one hand, this meant they didn't have to fight a giant, teleporting, god-touched Hydra. On the other hand, it was just like Zack said earlier. This meant that said Hydra could pop out of the orb when they least expected it and ruin the entire restart. We really need to figure out how to actually enter the damn orb, Zack said unhappily, turning the orb idly in his hands. We need to consider the possibility that the orb simply doesn't have that kind of ability built into it, Zorian told him, staring at the orb in Zack's hands in a speculative manner. Teleportation magic is tricky to make into magic items. There are recall rods that can teleport a person to a predetermined point and teleport platforms that can allow teleportation between fixed points, but anything more sophisticated requires a living caster. It might be that the previous owners of the orb used some kind of specialized spell to enter and leave the orb dimension. Lovely, Zack said, throwing the orb into the air and triggering its deployment mechanism. The orb distorted and then collapsed inward with a soft whooshing sound. In a flash it was gone, no visible trace of its presence anywhere. That means either searching for an obscure teleportation spell or creating one from scratch. That could take forever. As if we didn't have enough time sinks already. He reclaimed the orb, causing it to pop back to existence again, and then deployed it again immediately afterwards. If you are right, though, then this is really poor design, Zack continued. Why the hell would you not include a way in when making something like this? It shouldn't be that hard to place a teleport platform, recall stone or something similar inside. Then, when the owner of the orb commands it to, it pulls the person inside and deposits them there. That's a viable method, no? He reclaimed and then deployed the orb again. It is, Zorian agreed. And maybe there really was such a place inside the orb, once. But teleport platforms and recall stones don't last all that long without regular maintenance. Not for centuries, at least. And there is a chance that something inside actively broke the mechanism. Say, a giant rampaging Hydra. I didn't think of that, Zack scowled, reclaiming the orb again. We just don't see. When Zack deployed the orb the fourth time, there was a much louder whooshing sound than usual, and the two of them suddenly found themselves standing next to a gigantic, pissed-off Hydra. It immediately pounced on them with an unearthly roar. Needless to say, the next few minutes were somewhat hectic. Defeating the Hydra took longer than it had the last time they fought, but the fact they didn't have to worry about Daimen and his men dying actually made the battle easier. Things were a little hairy in the beginning, when the Hydra had caught them off guard, but after that they just kept themselves out of the Hydra's reach and kept hammering away at it until it decided the situation was hopeless and fled into the jungle. That took hours to do, though, because Zack had already reclaimed the orb by that point and the Hydra really didn't like that. It didn't help that Zorian was interested in how its multipart mind worked and thus spent most of the battle studying it instead of fighting it for real. They didn't chase after it to finish it off. Having it out of the orb was enough for them. They did spend a lot of time discussing what happened, though, and came to a conclusion that it was no accident that the Hydra had only emerged after Zack had deployed the orb. It was likely that the Hydra couldn't exit the orb while it was in its portable form and had to wait for Zack to deploy the orb before it could make the attempt. That, in turn, suggested that perhaps entering the orb without deploying it was similarly impossible, which would make their previous method of studying the orb while holding it in their hands a somewhat wrong-headed method of finding the entrance. Regardless, after claiming the orb and chasing off the Hydra that emerged from it, Zack and Zorian returned to their current base in Koth, the small Iranian base that the Silent Doorway adepts had established around the local Bakura gate. Zorian's previous suspicion that the Silent Doorway adepts would get friendlier and more open to his arguments if he brought them a functional gate address to Koth turned out to be true beyond his wildest dreams. The Urania went absolutely crazy once they tried it out and confirmed it worked. It took little more than 4 days for him to convince them that the time loop was real and that they should work with him, which was less than half of what it was before. He still sent a simulacrum on a slow journey to Koth, though, both because he didn't want to put all his eggs in one basket and because he needed it to establish a telepathic relay link to Koth by physically placing relay stones along the way. Still, he was extremely pleased that he managed to get this deal with the Silent Doorway adepts working. It wasn't absolutely crucial for reaching Koth, but it would be absolutely necessary when they decided to retrieve the piece of the key that was lost in Blantyre. Blantyre didn't have any notable human civilizations, meaning that ships traveling there were extremely rare. There was no convenient archipelago to serve as a bridge between continents and allow island hopping, so teleporting there was out of the question. The seas and coasts were wild and untamed, full of dangerous monsters and natural danger zones. Zorian had spoken to Dai Men about it, and the conclusion was that it was theoretically possible for them to reach Blantyre within the span of a month but only just. They would have to fully dedicate an entire restart for the task, and they would be left with a measly handful of days to explore Blantyre before the restart ended. Thankfully, Blantyre was seated full of Bakura gates. In fact, they were seated much more densely there, as if whatever power that had made the gates originated from that continent. This was curious because, as far as anyone knew, humanity had never really lived there in the past. Scholars often quarreled about what this meant, but Zorian didn't really care about those arguments. All he cared about was that the Bakura Gate network was pretty much the only viable method he had of reaching Blantyre in a timely manner. The fact that one of the Imperial artifacts was lost in Blantyre was one of the major worries he had about their chances to collect the entire key. Now that he knew he could potentially reach the continent in as little as 4 days if he acquired the correct gate address, it was like a giant rock was lifted off his shoulders. Maybe they really had a chance of doing this. "What about your brother?" Zack suddenly asked. "Didn't you hand him a notebook full of descriptions from our previous restart? Surely he left himself information about where the orb is." "He did, but I already told him we would be claiming it for ourselves," Zorian said. "Ha! He must have loved that," Zack said, smiling at Zorian slightly. "Yeah, he wasn't happy about that," Zorian nodded. "He wasn't too bitter, though. He knows he can't handle the Hydra without our help. He'd need more than a month just to find, vet and organize the extra mercenaries he'd have to hire to successfully retrieve the orb. He did make me promise I would let him have the orb once we were out of the time loop, though." "I guess that's fair," Zack shrugged. "I mean, I've really taken a liking to this thing, but he does sort of have a legitimate claim on it, and he's your brother to boot. You owe me, though." "I owe you," Zorian said, raising his eyebrow at him. "Owe you what?" "Another portable palace like this, of course," said Zack, waving the orb in front of Zorian's face. "You'll be trying to get crazy good at pocket dimensions soon, no? Surely, a measly little pocket dimension like this is no big deal." "Measly," he says. Information about pocket dimension creation was scarce, but what Zorian had found suggested that this orb was near the top end of what was possible to achieve. There were examples of bigger hidden worlds, but not many. "Correction," Zorian said blandly. "We'll be trying to get crazy good at pocket dimensions soon. Are you seriously telling me you'll pass by the opportunity to learn how to create one?" "I'd never pass up the opportunity to learn something so useful," Zack said with a grin. "But you're the one who's good at creating things, while I am more the kind of guy that breaks them. Plus, we've already established that you owe me. I've magnanimously decided to let your brother claim the orb outside the time loop as a favor to you. As recompense, you need to make another portable palace for me when we finally get out. We'll talk about that later, when we find out how feasible the idea actually is," Zorian told him lightly. "However, I can tell you right now that you're never getting an actual palace." "What?" Zack whined. "Why not?" "Because pocket dimensions don't create matter," Zorian told him. He pointed at the orb in Zack's hands. "If you want them to contain a piece of land like that one does, you basically have to steal it by enclosing an actual place into it during the creation process. So if you want a portable palace, well, you first need to build the palace in question. Putting aside the actual costs of such a project, which are bound to be astronomical, I just don't have the necessary skills to design and build a palace. Oh, Zack said. Yeah, that makes sense, I guess. Now, if you want a tastefully hollowed-out rock or a nice wooden cottage that I can definitely help you with, Zorian told him. Hell, I might even be able to fit in some actual glass windows if you want me to be extravagant. That triggered a lengthy argument about what kind of building would be possible for a single mage to build on his own, using only natural materials. The argument eventually culminated into a building competition where both Zack and Zorian did their best to construct the most luxurious residence they could with the materials they had on hand. If any jungle explorer were to stumble upon the site several hours later, they would probably be baffled by the series of towers, ziggurats, and blocky houses scattered throughout the entire region. Alas, this part of the jungle was very remote and no such explorer would ever come before the restart ended. The bats and other animals that moved into the buildings after a few days definitely appreciated their new accommodations, though. Zack and Zorian floated in the black void. The black sky that surrounded them was omnidirectional and featureless, containing only one point of interest: a roughly humanoid entity with softly glowing eyes. The Guardian of the Threshold. It had been a while since they visited this place. They tried not to interact with the Guardian too much, lest they accidentally trigger some kind of safeguard, and it realized there were two controllers inside the time loop and that it should do something about that. However, now that they'd gotten their hands on a piece of the key, it only made sense for them to come and visit the Sovereign Gate to see how it would react. "Welcome, controller," the Guardian said, its voice just as soft and devoid of emotion as Zorian remembered it to be. The entity gave no indication it remembered their last visit to this place. "We have questions for you," Zack told the Guardian bluntly. "I will do my best to answer them," the Guardian agreed placidly. They didn't ask it about the orb immediately. Instead, they first confirmed the number of restarts they had until the time loop collapsed, just in case. They had 42 left, exactly as it should be. After that, Zorian summoned a list of questions the two of them had prepared for the Guardian over the previous restarts, concerning Red Robe, the mechanics of the time loop and so on. They didn't get anywhere with that, of course. The Guardian either didn't know how to help them or flat out refused to do so when they asked things they weren't authorized to know. They had expected that, but it was still frustrating to be foiled so thoroughly. In any case, once they had exhausted their prepared list of questions, they finally moved on to the main purpose of this visit. "Guardian, can you tell us more about the key now?" Zorian asked. "To find out about the key, please bring me the key for inspection," the Guardian told him. Yes, in order to find out about the key, we must first have the key." "A perfectly logical requirement," Zack said, rolling his eyes. "But we're not here for that. Our question is this: if we bring you a single piece of the key, does that count for something? Do we get to ask you questions about it? Having only one piece of the key will result in information about that part only," the Guardian noted. "That's fine," Zack said dismissively. "We brought you one of the pieces, so why don't you take a look?" "I do not see it," the Guardian told him immediately. "Are you sure you have connected it to the control room properly?" "Wait, we have to do what?" Zack asked incredulously. As it turned out, simply having the pieces of the key on them when they connected to the Sovereign Gate wasn't enough. The Guardian neither knew nor cared what they had on their person when they entered this void it inhabited. Instead, it was up to Zack and Zorian to connect the orb to the Sovereign Gate so the Guardian could inspect it and confirm its authenticity. How were they supposed to do that? The Guardian was naturally of no help whatsoever. It took them 2 hours of frustrated tinkering before they realized they had to use their marker as a sort of bridge, simultaneously connecting it to both the Sovereign Gate and the orb. Only then did the Guardian recognize it. This is indeed a legitimate piece of the key, the Guardian decided. Finally, Zack huffed. "So what does this get us?" "Nothing on its own," the Guardian responded. You need the entire key to unlock higher authorization than you have now. However, you can now ask me for information about it like you wanted earlier. Keep in mind that I have no knowledge of the object's mundane functions. I can only give you information about it as it relates to the time loop. So if we asked you about the pocket dimension contained in the orb, began Zorian. I couldn't help you, the Guardian said. I didn't even know there was a pocket dimension encapsulated within the key piece until you told me. There was a second of silence as both Zack and Zorian frowned at the information. This was not completely unexpected. It had been very obvious during their previous visit that the Guardian did not perceive the world in the same way humans did and often just plain disregarded things not related to its job. Still, this was disappointing to hear. All right, said Zack eventually. So what can you tell us about the orb, then? What are its capabilities as it relates to the time loop? It contains a memory bank that the controller can use to store and organize their important memories across restarts, the Guardian said. Wait, what? Zack and Zorian shared a shocked glance, not having expected this at all. A memory bank, Zorian repeated slowly. Yes, the Guardian confirmed. You should be able to sense an empty space inside if you focus on the key piece correctly. Simply focus on the memories you want to store in the bank and push them inside. Once inside, they will persist from restart to restart and be available for viewing at any time, unless you choose to delete them at some point. Keep in mind that this ability only exists inside the time loop. Once you leave and this reality permanently collapses, all of the memories you stored inside the key piece will be similarly destroyed. Make sure to refresh on anything important you placed there before you leave. There was a brief silence as the two of them digested this information. I guess we now know what that mysterious empty space inside the orb was, Zorian finally said. Yeah, Zack said distractedly, lost in thought for a second. He then took a deep breath and turned to Zorian again. It sounds very convenient. Yes, Zorian agreed. The ability was a little redundant to him, what with his ability to create memory packets, but he could imagine that an average controller would find the ability absolutely invaluable. It was almost like having a notebook that carried over from restart to restart, only better. Guardian, is there any limit on the amount of memories this bank can hold? There are limits to everything, the Guardian told him. But you are highly unlikely to ever reach these particular ones. Even if you found a way to store your entire memory and did so in every single restart, you would not come even close to filling the available space inside the memory bank. Good to know. This gave him some very nice ideas. After all, if he could unload most of the notebooks he had kept in his head into the orb, he could really go wild in recruiting experts and having them continue their work across restarts. Do you think the other Imperial artifacts have similar abilities? Zorian asked Zack. Probably, agreed Zack. Hey, Guardian. What about the other pieces? Do they all give us an ability related to the time loop? To find out about the other pieces of the key, please bring them to me for inspection, the Guardian answered. Yeah, dumb question, I guess, Zack said, clacking his tongue. But I think they probably do all give an ability. No reason for the orb to be the only one. Now I'm even more anxious to get my hands on these things. No wonder we haven't been able to find a way to place temporary markers or remove people from the time loop, said Zorian after some thought. No doubt those two abilities are also tied to Imperial artifacts. Probably the crown Quadakikul is wearing and that dagger that is in Eldamar's royal treasury. Zack gave it some thought. You may be right, he eventually said. Which do you think gives what? Well, purely thematically speaking, I'd guess that the knife is what removes people from the time loop, said Zorian. Which would leave the crown as the artifact that allows for the placement of temporary markers. It does make sense if you think of the temporary markers as subordinate to the main one, Zack mused. The main marker is the ruler, and the ruler needs a crown. The Guardian of the Threshold remained silent during this conversation, giving no indication it had heard anything. Pity. Zorian had hoped it might react a bit and therefore indicate how close they were hitting to the truth. He really wondered how that thing was made. It appeared to be a mindless automaton, but some of its responses were sufficiently lifelike that he had trouble treating it as a purely mindless thing. Guardian, will you remember that we've already brought you this piece the next time we visit, or do we need to bring all 5 pieces simultaneously to get higher authorization? Zorian asked. You must bring the entire key if you want higher authorization, the Guardian said. Damn, Zack swore. We suspected it would be like this, Zorian sighed. They spent another hour pestering the Guardian about the orb and the memory bank it contained. They didn't find out anything terribly important though, so they eventually disconnected themselves from the Sovereign Gate. Unlike the first time they had gone here, this time they'd made much more thorough, sophisticated preparations. As such, they didn't find their bodies catastrophically damaged by the time they were ready to leave. Quite the contrary, the researchers left them well enough alone with no mind magic necessary. This was partially because they'd brought much more intimidating forgeries of their credentials and partially because they were trailed by 2 massive bodyguards that kept watch while they were communicating with the Guardian. The bodyguards were, of course, just particularly lifelike golems that Zorian had made for the occasion. They were actually pretty terrible as far as golems went, but they looked human enough to fool casual inspection, and that was the only thing that mattered. Their only job was to follow them around in utter silence, looking all grim and intimidating. They didn't immediately leave the time magic research facility. They had come here not just to have a chat with the Guardian of the Threshold, but also because they wanted to make use of the Black Room for the restart. However, they had made a mistake this time. They decided to bring the orb of the First Emperor with them into the Black Room. It was a tempting idea. If they could bring a portable palace with them into the temporal acceleration area, then it didn't matter much that space was so limited. They could bring everything they needed, even people, inside the orb. The main limitation of the Black Room would be broken. Sure, they still didn't know how to actually enter the pocket dimension contained in the orb, but neither of them thought the procedure would forever elude them. And besides, they didn't need to be able to enter the orb to test the viability of the idea. All they had to do was bring the orb with them into the Black Room and see what would happen. Well, what happened was that the Black Room shut itself down almost instantly after initiating temporal acceleration. After an hour of analysis and heated discussion with nervous researchers, Zack and Zorian found out that the price of temporally accelerating an area of space was based on the volume of space being accelerated. By bringing a palace worth of space inside, even inside a pocket dimension, the two of them massively inflated the mana cost of the operation procedure. Not to mention that the facility itself was not designed to handle that kind of strain. As such, the Black Room ran out of mana in less than a second and immediately shut itself down. The researchers, though still somewhat intimidated by them, gave them a severe tongue-lashing for even trying the idea without consulting them about it beforehand. Oh, and they were really interested in studying the orb. Zorian actually considered letting them do so, just to see what a group of dedicated researchers like this could tell them about the artifact, but refused their request for the moment. He had to set things up very carefully before giving them the orb, or else he would simply be handing it to the Eldamarian authorities and starting a manhunt for the two of them. I wonder if this is true for the time loop as well, Zack mused later, when they were out of the facility. If we create our own pocket dimensions here, aren't we also increasing the volume that needs to be temporally accelerated and thus creating a strain on the system? Probably, Zorian said. But the time loop reality is so huge that even if we increased its internal volume a bit by opening additional pocket dimensions, the added power drain should be pretty minuscule. The problem with the Black Room is that it's pretty tiny. The space inside the orb is actually many times larger than the Black Room itself. As such, bringing the orb into the Black Room is like trying to transport an elephant inside a tiny, one-man boat. No matter what clever method you use to make it fit, it still weighs so much it would sink the whole setup. I fear this idea is dead in the water. Shame, said Zack. The orb does a pretty good job of isolating the space inside from the rest of reality, though. That's kind of what the Black Room is meant to accomplish, only better. What if, instead of trying to bring the orb inside the Black Room, we simply ditched the Black Room altogether and retooled the entire facility to apply its temporal acceleration effect on the orb itself? I know the space inside the orb is much more massive than the Black Room, but maybe the effects of a better dimensional boundary overshadow that. And really, even if it produces less drastic acceleration, I'd rather spend half a month inside a palace than a full month inside a tiny cramped room. An interesting idea, Zorian admitted. We'd need to get willing cooperation from the staff of the facility to pull something of that scale, though. No way could we pull this off ourselves, especially not on a super-secret research facility financed by the Eldamarian government. Zorian still made a mental note to revisit the idea later. Perhaps it wasn't very feasible at the moment, but they needed every advantage they could get. On one unremarkable Sunday morning, Zorian woke up to find Amaya's house under siege. Well, not a literal siege, but the throng of people gathered around the entrance was impressively large and thoroughly blocked anyone's ability to get in or out of the house. Zorian was quite mystified by this, since he couldn't think of anything he had done that would cause such an occurrence. Zorian joined the other inhabitants of the house, who had awoken far sooner than him, in staring warily through the window at the mass of people surrounding the house. They seemed to be quite a diverse bunch, ranging from simple curious neighbors that had gathered to see what was happening to groups of healers, mages, various guild recruiters and newspaper reporters. "Dare I ask what this is about?" Zorian asked Amaya, who was nervously wringing her hands as she eyed the gathered crowd with a wary eye. "It's my fault," Kale spoke up in an embarrassed voice. "I'm sorry." "What do you mean it's your fault?" Zorian asked curiously. "What did you do exactly?" "Well, you know how I keep working on better medicines. And how I've been recruiting other alchemists and healers in my work. Well, the results of that effort are getting kind of impressive. Impressive enough to cause a stir. Especially when they come from someone as young as me with no real backer," Kale explained. He shuffled in place uncomfortably and Kana squeezed herself closer to him, disturbed by the fearful, awkward atmosphere in the room. "I'm really sorry. I hadn't considered this possibility at all." Zorian shook his head, not really angry at the boy. Part of the blame rested on him too. He should have paid closer attention to what Kale was doing and what kind of attention it was garnering. Though in all honesty, this was just a mild inconvenience for him. He could teleport in and out of the house at will. They were initially much more aggressive about trying to get in, Amaya told him. But those wards you placed on the house stopped them cold, so they've been more restrained since then. The wards themselves drew some people here, though. I'm not sure, but I think some people from the Mage Guild are here to talk to you about that. It was only then that Zorian remembered that raising heavy wards around a residence required a special permit from the city's Mage Guild. A permit that Zorian didn't have. He had been warding places so often these days, with zero regard for local laws and customs, that he had almost forgotten that this sort of thing was regulated in most places. Okay, maybe this was more than just a mild inconvenience. In the mountains of southern Altazia, there was a fairly famous cave system that surrounded an ancient volcano. The volcano hadn't been active in over a century, but the cave still held spacious caverns and winding corridors full of lava that never cooled. This was a magically powerful place heavily aligned with fire, and it was absolutely teeming with fire elementals. And one of those elementals was Kiln Father, the elder fire elemental that Zack and Zorian were currently visiting. Kiln Father wasn't the oldest of the elder elementals living in this place, but he was the only one even remotely interested in talking with humans. The others lived deep in the lava fields of the volcano cavern system. Simply reaching their strongholds would be a monumental task, considering the incredible heat and the omnipresent poisonous fumes of their home environment, and convincing a taciturn elemental to talk with you was a notoriously futile endeavor. So Kiln Father it was. They met Kiln Father in a wide, spacious cavern of black basalt stone. Steam and poisonous fumes billowed up from the cracks in the floor and walls, but the air was entirely breathable with the aid of the right air filtering spells. As for the temperature, well, it was hot, but not unhealthily so. They could endure it for the few hours the talks would last. The only thing Zack and Zorian really had to watch for was not to hurt any of the Kilnfather's children. Kilnfather looked like a giant gecko made out of cooling lava. He was black, with cracked skin that pulsed with inner fire, dimming and brightening in a regular rhythm. His eyes were big, yellow, slitted and shining. Surrounding him was a small throng of smaller black geckos that looked like tiny copies of him. If one looked at the smaller geckos closely enough, however, they would notice they were not elementals like Kilnfather. They were actual living beings. The black geckos had been, as far as anyone could tell, just regular animals until Kilnfather had implanted some of his elemental spirit into them, causing them to swell in size and develop powerful fire-based magic. Kilnfather loved his creations with all his heart, to the point where he styled his entire appearance after them, and some people speculated he was trying to shape them into a legitimate sapient species as time went by. He did not tolerate any violence towards his beloved children, and would immediately start hostilities with anyone who hurt so much as a scale on their back and call the rest of the domain's fire elementals for help if he thought he was outmatched. "Welcome, guests," Kilnfather said, his voice deep and resonant. Come closer, come closer. Mind my children, please." They can sometimes get a little overzealous in their welcome, but they always mean well. "Kilnfather is as welcoming as stories say," Zorian said politely. "Hopefully these two guests will be found worthy of your hospitality. Please accept our gifts." They directed the floating field of force that carried a small basalt chest towards Kilnfather, forcing it to stop at a respectful distance from the elemental. It opened on its own, revealing a plethora of rare stones and materials that were said to be attractive to fire elementals. "Oh my, you shouldn't have," Kilnfather said, his large, bright yellow tongue darting out his mouth to lick his eyes one by one. "But it would be impolite of me to refuse a gift." "What was it that you said you came here for?" "Well," began Zorian. "We were wondering if you ever heard of any of the locations where the primordials were imprisoned." House Latova was a fairly important house in Falkrinia. They were a new house, having achieved their status due to their knowledge of certain unique potions that nobody else could figure out how to make, but their future looked rather promising. Their potion business was booming, giving them plenty of money to throw around to make themselves heard and boost their political influence in Falkrinia and elsewhere. Naturally, they guarded the secrets of their alchemy very, very closely. They invested a great deal of their newfound wealth into security, well aware that if their competitors managed to get their hands on their secrets, their ascent to greatness would be greatly jeopardized. Today, Zack and Zorian were trying to break into House Latova's alchemy repository. They weren't doing it because they honestly wanted to steal their alchemical secrets, though Zorian would take a look at their records if they succeeded, simply to satisfy his curiosity. No, they were doing it because they wanted to practice their ability to break into secure areas. The problem was simple. They needed to get the Imperial dagger that was stored in the Eldamarian royal palace. However, the palace was way out of their league at the moment. They just didn't have enough experience in breaking into places like that. Thus, Zorian had hit upon the idea of targeting minor houses, gradually tackling greater and greater challenges until they gathered enough expertise in infiltration to tackle their real goal. They had already tried their hand at breaking into some wealthy estates, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. House Latova would be their biggest challenge yet. "You know," Zack had told him before they launched the mission, "I am amused by the fact that you have qualms about stealing people's secrets by rooting through their minds, but have no problems at all about physically rooting through their stuff." "It's not the same," Zorian protested. "I know," Zack said. "And don't get me wrong, it actually sets me at ease that you have some standards about your mind magic usage. I can't help but find it a bit amusing, though." "You don't seem to have any problems going along with this," Zorian remarked. "Nah, I've done things like this all the time when I was alone," Zack said dismissively. "Only with less sneaking in and more blasting the door off its hinges and powering through the wards." One of these days we'll have to do these raids my way. It's a rush. I bet you'd love it. Zorian snorted. I bet I wouldn't, he countered. Though maybe you're on to something. Somehow I feel less conflicted about taking people's notebooks, research documentation and the like than I do about taking their thoughts and memories. Mind magic is something I can do on a whim. It's easy, it's convenient, and I don't think I'm a good enough person to resist the temptation to use it all the time if I get into the habit of using it lightly. But this kind of thing, it's terrifying and stressful and takes effort to organize and pull off. I'll probably never feel casual about it. Hummed Zack. I wouldn't be so sure. Almost anything gets pretty mundane if you do it long enough. But it is true that raids like this aren't something you do on impulse alone. Anyway, we came here to steal alchemical recipes, not to talk philosophy. Are we doing this or not? We're doing it, responded Zorian. Let's go. 9 restarts had passed since the restart in which Zack and Zorian had found where the orb of the first emperor was located. The two of them had worked on their skills, sought out experts and raided places for practice and critical secrets. They expanded their research initiatives massively, making use of the orb's memory bank to store all the research notes that resulted from this, and then found new sources of money and materials to pay for all this. Sudamir was completely interrogated several times and his knowledge of the invasion and soul magic made full use of. They worked with Daimen to get in touch with his friends and colleagues, narrowing down the location for the piece of the key that was lost in the Zlotic desert. They worked hard to understand and reverse engineer the Abasin gate and tried to figure out a faster, easier way to activate the Bakura gates. They managed to enter the orb near the end of this period. They had been forced to design a specialized teleportation spell to do so, which took multiple restarts due to the rarity of pocket dimension magic and the corresponding difficulty of finding the right experts and manuals. When they had finally managed to get in, they found that the pocket dimension did contain a teleport platform that served as an inbuilt entrance, but the platform had broken down a long time ago due to lack of maintenance. Once the platform was fixed, the spell was no longer necessary, but since they were in the time loop, this repair was undone at the end of every restart. Zack and Zorian eventually stopped bothering to repair the platform and just used the spell to enter and leave as they wish. The spell was the superior option anyway, since it allowed them to enter and leave the orb in any location they wished. As for the contents of the orb, well, they hadn't found any more giant hydras inside, much to Zack's disappointment. They had found a lot of dangerous plants and animals, though, so it was hardly peaceful. They also found a great deal of potions, magical equipment, secret grimoires and valuable materials, virtually all of which had expired, rotted, broken down or were hopelessly outdated. They had high hopes that there was something good buried in all that trash and rubble, and were still stubbornly combing through it. Mercifully, the general decay of the place also extended to palace defenses. It was clear the palace had once sported impressive wards and a frankly ridiculous number of traps, giant boulders rolling down the corridors seriously, but most of them had broken down over the centuries. Currently, Zorian was sitting on the grass in the middle of an isolated meadow. Not far from him was a simulacrum absorbed in assembling a magical rifle, tirelessly pondering design improvements and occasionally testing out prototypes on a distant rock. Zorian didn't want to disturb him, but made a mental note to himself to add better sound dampening wards on the final design. Those magical rifles he had been building were painfully loud. Though considering how large some of the latest designs were getting, that was to be expected. He had told the simulacrum to design a better rifle, not a portable cannon, damn it. In any case, Zorian himself was controlling a group of golems against a group consisting of Zack, Alanik, Svim and Taven. His 4 opponents were holding back a lot, or else the golems wouldn't last very long, but that was okay. This wasn't a test of his golem-making skills, it was a combat exercise meant to test different tactics and figure out the most effective method of controlling and deploying his golems. He took advantage of a short pause in the battle to quickly check up on his simulacrum and cough. These days he no longer needed a long chain of telepathic relays to do so. The soul magic knowledge he got from Sudamir had allowed him to devise a method of establishing telepathic contact with his simulacrums through the soul they all shared. He found out that the simulacrum was busy arranging some kind of trade deal along with Daimen and left him to his devices. Eventually the combat exercise ended and the other four joined Zorian in relaxing on the grass. Well, they were relaxing until the simulacrum fired its prototype cannon again and startled them all with another devastating boom. "Gods, Zorian," Taven complained. "That thing your copy is building is like a miniature siege engine and you're still not satisfied? What on earth do you need a gun like that for?" Zorian smiled at her. "We're going to kill a giant spider," he told her. "And then we're going to visit an annoying old woman with its remains." Simulacrum number 4 was worried. He really shouldn't be, considering what he was and how many times the original had fought the Grey Hunter by now. If anything, he should be feeling excited. He had a good feeling about this attempt. Their skills had grown, they had become intimately familiar with the Grey Hunter's capabilities and they had brought a number of surprises designed specifically to counter it. This could work. This could actually work, unlike so many previous attempts they'd made. Maybe that was it. In their previous attempts, Zorian and, by extension, Simulacrum number 4 had always felt the attempt was a long shot. Even if they failed, it was to be expected. This time he actually felt good about their chances, making him more emotionally invested in the outcome. Then again, they actually had a pressing need for the Grey Hunter's eggs this time. They could contact Silver Lake without them, but talking to Silver Lake was going to be much harder and much more annoying if they couldn't bring her something she desperately wanted. He unconsciously clutched the rifle closer to his chest, the sensation of it dispelling his current stream of thought. He remembered practicing with it over and over, but it still felt a bit alien to his mind and so did the arms that held it. He was a brand new type of simulacrum that the original had thought up recently. Instead of being embodied into an ectoplasmic shell like a regular simulacrum, he had been attached to a real matter golem body designed to mimic the original. This was a step up from the base spell in just about every regard, granting him vastly increased durability and having his maintenance cost at the same time. It allowed Zorian to maintain twice the usual number of simulacrums and ensured that they wouldn't be destroyed by relatively minor damage. The only downside was that making the golem bodies was very time-consuming, and that the materials were expensive as hell. Or at least that was the idea, anyway. The simulacrum actually felt significantly stiffer and more restricted in his movements than he was used to, a clear sign that his joints weren't working quite as well as the original had hoped they would. No doubt the original would find a way to fix or mitigate these issues as time went by, but that would make no difference for him personally. He really hoped he wouldn't lock up or miss in the actual battle because of this. Alas, the time for contemplation was over. A short message rippled out of his soul and into his consciousness, informing him, and the other 3 simulacrums gathered around the area, that the original was about to start the fight. He quickly checked up on his rifle one final time and then sent a confirmation that he was ready through the exact same method, using their shared soul as a conduit for communication. Very convenient, that. The original was already working on further upgrades, based on their studies of the Hydra and the cephalic rat collective, but that was still in the initial stages and nowhere near ready for field use. For now, normal, soul conduit communication would have to suffice. And then it began. The Grey Hunter leapt out of its cave and immediately moved to attack Zack and Zorian, completely ignoring the simulacrum scattered around the area. A swarm of projectiles answered its charge, Zack and Zorian doing their best to keep it pressured without wasting too much of their mana reserves. Zack launched powerful beams of force at it, forcing it to keep dodging and breaking up its momentum. Zorian, on the other hand, borrowed Kurma's trick holding a grayish metal cube as a spell focus. He launched swarms of smaller, cheaper projectiles that homed in unerringly on the Grey Hunter's weak points. He timed his attack to coincide with Zack's, forcing the Grey Hunter to take at least a few hits from every barrage. Although individually weak and unable to truly threaten the Grey Hunter, they were apparently doing something because the spider was clearly getting angrier and more agitated as seconds ticked by. Simulacrum number 4 trailed the Grey Hunter with the scope of his rifle, but did not shoot. The Grey Hunter was currently ignoring the simulacrums because it did not perceive them as a threat, but that wouldn't last very long if they started blindly firing into the battle zone. No, if he and his duplicate brethren wanted to help Zack and the original, they needed to pick their moment carefully. The problem with using the gun on the Grey Hunter wasn't in whether or not it could dodge the bullet. It couldn't. To Zorian's knowledge, nothing was fast enough to dodge a projectile that moved faster than sound itself. The problem was that the spider never sat still long enough to get a good shot on it. Bullets didn't track their target, and using magic to make them do so was incredibly difficult. The most Zorian could do was curve their trajectories slightly towards where he wanted them to hit. And the simulacrums didn't just have to hit the Grey Hunter, they had to hit it in a way that left the egg sac unharmed. Basically, they needed the Grey Hunter to stay still for a second. A tall order, but the simulacrum was confident that Zack and the original could pull it off. The Grey Hunter lunged toward Zorian. Zack was a bigger threat, but Zorian was more annoying and probably looked more vulnerable to its senses. If it could get rid of the annoying weakling first, it could then focus its full attention on the true threat and its victory would be assured. But looks could be deceptive. The Grey Hunter smashed straight into Zorian's shield at full force and was stopped cold. The thick barrier of force that surrounded Zorian was a marvel of spell engineering, a custom spell that Zorian had designed with the help of a dozen professional spell crafters to make maximum use of. Zorian's exceptional shaping skills. The softly glowing threads, woven through every inch of the thick sphere of force, lit up like blazing lamps, distributing the incoming force away from the impact points and into the shield as a whole, lessening the strain on any individual point in the shield. The Grey Hunter attacked the shield again and again in quick succession, and it finally gave way, but rather than the whole shield shattering, 3 small hexagons of force broke down instead, leaving the main structure unharmed. Before the Grey Hunter could take advantage of that, the entire shield shifted and automatically rearranged itself, nearby hexagons sliding into place to close the gap. Suddenly aware that Zorian was no easy target to be brought down quickly, the Grey Hunter tried to back off, but it was too late. Zack had positioned himself carefully while the Grey Hunter had been trying to batter down Zorian's shield, and now launched a barrage of 3 hyperdense stone spheres at the spider. The Grey Hunter spun around like an acrobat, deflecting the spheres away from itself with measured kicks, but Zorian took advantage of its predicament to launch a pair of metal cylinders at it. The Grey Hunter, accustomed to weathering Zorian's annoying but weak attacks and not seeing any great concentration of mana in the cylinders, chose to ignore them in favor of the much more threatening stone spheres. Just before they were going to impact the Grey Hunter, the cylinders detonated into a cacophony of sound, bright light, magical disturbances and aromatic smoke, all of it specifically optimized for Grey Hunter senses. Dazed and disoriented by the flashbang grenades, the Grey Hunter stumbled and stopped. Just for a moment. Simulacrum number 4 pulled the trigger. Another deafening blast sounded out, closely followed by 2 more. Simulacrum number 2 didn't fire, as he was positioned very inconveniently and there was a danger he could hit the egg sac if he fired. Of the 3 bullets, 1 missed the Grey Hunter completely. Simulacrum number 1 had apparently aimed his shot so poorly that not even the trajectory-correcting magics the original placed on the bullet could help. It didn't matter, though both he and number 3 had hit the Grey Hunter straight into its cephalothorax, the bullet successfully breaking through its carapace. It was a testament to the Grey Hunter's toughness that, mere moments following this, it shook off the stun effect and retreated at top speed, as if it hadn't just been shot twice in the head with high-caliber armor-piercing bullets. But it didn't matter. It was living on borrowed time. From the moment those bullets sank into its flesh, its fate was sealed. The bullets were filled with the distilled essence of the crystal ooze, a magical creature every bit as powerful as the Grey Hunter, whose touch turned all flesh into inert crystal. The crystallization bullets, as Zorian called them, were already turning the Grey Hunter's organs into lifeless crystal, and there was nothing the spider could do about it. The Grey Hunter seemed to realize it too. It went berserk, lunging at Zack and Zorian with even greater zeal, and then tried to flee. They couldn't allow that, of course. If it escaped, it would doubtlessly retreat into the deep dungeon and hide before dying, and other denizens of the dungeon might eat the egg sac before they could track down its corpse. Thus, walls of stone and force sprang up to bar its path, ectoplasmic threads and tentacles sought to entangle it, and dimensional gates barred the path to its lair. Eventually, the internal crystallization process advanced too far for the Grey Hunter to keep functioning, and it started to visibly slow and then stop. Simulacrum number 4 and his fellow duplicates were then sent in to hack it apart and claim the egg sac, because the original was too much of a coward to do it himself. Then again, the Grey Hunter did mangle one of the simulacrums beyond repair as its last act before dying, so maybe he shouldn't judge. But anyway, the Grey Hunter was dead and the egg sac was still intact. It was time to visit Silver Lake again. After some thought, Simulacrum number 4 wandered off from the Grey Hunter's corpse and sought out the original to talk to him about visiting the old witch. He was so looking forward to seeing her reaction when she realized what they had done, and it wasn't fair that he wouldn't get to see it just because he was a simulacrum. He was the one that shot the Grey Hunter. Well, he and number 3, but number 3 ended up being killed by the Grey Hunter's last hurrah. He totally earned this and was not taking no for an answer. After securing the corpse of the Grey Hunter, Zorian and his simulacrums went about carefully removing the egg sac attached to its underbelly without damaging it, a task far harder than Zorian would initially have assumed it would be. Then again, the egg sac had stayed attached to the Grey Hunter while it was doing all sorts of sharp movements and acrobatics, so it was a bit silly of him to assume he could just peel it off the spider as he wished. Still, it was nothing that Zorian and his duplicates couldn't solve with a bit of time and analysis. After an hour or so, they finally managed to separate the egg sac from the corpse without ruining it. They immediately set off to see Silver Lake. They had no idea what it took to keep the eggs alive in the long term, after all, so it was better to deliver them to Silver Lake as soon as possible. They also kept the Grey Hunter's corpse, stashing it in the orb of the First Emperor. Much of its value was ruined when its insides crystallized, but there should still be enough of it for a potion or two. After some reasoned and totally calm discussion, Zorian also decided to take Simulacrum number 4 with him to see Silver Lake. Being accompanied by a simulacrum might help him convince her that he wasn't just a precocious teenage mage and that she should actually take him seriously. In any case, tracking down Silver Lake's home wasn't hard this time around. She may have hidden it in a pocket dimension, but Zorian knew the general area it was in and had specialized divinations that could find such things. They didn't try to break into the pocket dimension, though. That would have been threatening and rude. Instead, they got her attention in a more civilized manner by taking the Grey Hunter's corpse out of the orb and parading it around the pocket dimension entrance while chanting her name. It didn't take long before she decided to come out to meet them. She gave the dead Grey Hunter a quick, intrigued look before seemingly ignoring it in favor of focusing on them instead. She remained standing next to the entrance to her pocket dimension, though, a long iron rod clutched tightly in her bony fingers. "Hello," Zack said, giving her a sunny smile and a casual wave of his hand. "What a curious bunch of visitors you are," Silver Lake said, unmoved by his friendliness. "It's not every day that 2 baby mages manage to track me down to this place, and is that a simulacrum attached to a golem frame? My, aren't you a clever sort?" "Well, you're a pretty clever sort yourself," Zorian noted. "You figured out what my simulacrum is without casting any obvious analysis spells." He really meant that, too. Certainly he couldn't pull off something like that. He'd have to spend several minutes casting analytical divinations before he could work out what he was dealing with. Granted, she may have done that before she stepped out of her pocket dimension, but it was still impressive. "Well, out with it," Silver Lake demanded. "Why are you bothering this old woman in the middle of her afternoon nap, making all this racket?" "We have come to trade," Zack said in an equally cheery tone, undaunted by her wariness. We have killed the Grey Hunter and retrieved its eggs fully intact, Zorian said without preamble, waving his hand at the corpse of the giant spider on the ground next to them. His simulacrum, meanwhile, casually extracted the Grey Hunter's eggs from the box he was carrying, letting Silverlake see them. Her eyes immediately lit up with greed and excitement. She hid it quite quickly, but it was there. We thought you might be interested in them. Oh. And why did you think that? Silverlake asked him, inclining her head to the side, like a bird that spotted something interesting. Because you told me so in the past, Zorian said blandly. Because I told you so in the past, Silverlake repeated slowly, looking at him like he was stupid. What a curious thing to say. Old I may be, but my memory is still going strong and I don't remember ever talking to you. Zack and Zorian had discussed extensively what to tell Silverlake before coming to this place. Telling her the truth about the time loop was dangerous, because she was likely proficient in both soul and mind magic. She was a highly capable witch, after all, and they were famous for dabbling in both of those fields. However, convincing her to help them through lies and manipulations would take a long time, and time was, amusingly enough, something they had a chronic shortage of. Thus, they had unanimously decided to just tell the annoying old witch the truth and see how she reacted. Even if she was hostile, they could probably handle it. Probably. You don't remember because the world we live in is constantly repeating itself. On the night of the summer festival, the world ends. Everything reverts to how it was the month before, and then carries on as if nothing was wrong. Like an endlessly repeating music box, you repeat your actions over and over in month-long intervals, constantly forgetting, constantly starting over, Zorian explained, being deliberately a little melodramatic and mysterious. Silverlake listened to his explanation with an arched eyebrow, looking surprised and amused in equal measure. My word, you came all this way just to deliver this kind of tall tale to me? Silverlake said, chuckling lightly. I suppose I can understand where you're coming from. I have been told, on occasion, that I am rather repetitive in my arguments. It's not just you, Zorian said, shaking his head. Everyone is reliving this month over and over. Only me and Zack here are immune. Oh, but of course. Silverlake said, slapping herself in the forehead. Of course it's like that. No doubt I too can get this kind of immunity at very favorable prices, thus saving myself from this awful, awful fate of repeating myself for all eternity. I must say, the scammers these days are getting really inventive. Actually, there is nothing we can do to help you retain awareness of previous restarts, Zack said, clacking his tongue unhappily. Kind of depressing, but there you go. We're not here for that. As I have noted earlier, we're here to trade the Grey Hunter's eggs in exchange for magical help. Silverlake stayed silent for a second. Ah, I see, she finally said. This is just you answering my question. I asked how you knew I needed the Grey Hunter's eggs and you gave me an answer. I supposed if I asked you for an actual explanation. This is an actual explanation, Zorian said. It's not my fault you don't believe me. Humph, Silverlake scoffed. Out of curiosity, during this conversation that I have no memory of, did I ever actually tell you what I needed the Grey Hunter's eggs for? No, you did not, Zorian admitted. To be honest, I was rather angry with you back then and didn't inquire too deeply. I came to you for help with a pressing problem and you sent me on all sorts of tasks, all of which I did without complaint. But my only reward was to be told to go after the Grey Hunter for its eggs. I was a lot weaker back then, so that basically amounted to sending me on an impossible task in order to get rid of me. That does sound like something I would do, Silverlake nodded sagely. Which brings me to my next point, why are you so certain that I actually desire these eggs? Maybe I just sent you on a fool's errand to waste your time, and didn't actually care about the outcome. Well, the truth was that Zorian didn't know this for certain. He was making an educated guess, based on things like her clearly having tried to acquire the eggs herself in the past. But she didn't have to know that. I'm an empath, he told her. So I am certain you do want these eggs very, very much. Silver Lake scowled at him. A mind mage, she spat out in disgust. I have the most rotten luck, I swear. I only like mind magic when I'm the one using it on others. Fine, fine, I admit it, I do want the Grey Hunter's eggs, but they're not as valuable as you might hope. Meaning? Zorian asked calmly. I have an important project that requires them, but it's only one of the two critical components that I lack. If you had brought both of them, I would really be desperate to make a deal with you. But it's a shame, for without the other critical component, the eggs are merely interesting. Zack rolled his eyes at her. You're just like Zorian described you, he said. Every time one of your tasks is accomplished, you come up with another one. Well, that's not very fair, she said reasonably. I don't remember ever giving you a task, after all. But that aside, I never said I will not trade for the eggs. I just said you better not hope to swindle something actually good from me in exchange for something that minor. Minor, she says. Right. Out of curiosity, what is this other critical component? Zorian asked. Bones and certain organs of a giant brown salamander that has grown past a certain size, Silver Lake said. That's it? Zack asked incredulously. Those things are everywhere around here. It's not as simple as it sounds, Silver Lake said. Yes, there are plenty of them to be found in the rivers and creeks around us, but they simply aren't big enough, not mature enough. Giant brown salamanders never die of old age, you see. They simply get bigger. But they are a fairly weak type of magical creature, and they grow really slowly past a certain point, so almost none of them reach the size I need them to be. I need a salamander that has survived for at least 100 years, and that's incredibly rare. They can't be bred in captivity? Zack asked. Silver Lake looked at him like he just asked the dumbest thing ever. Who would be willing to wait 100 years for a creature to grow up, she asked. Nobody has that much time, boy. Besides, they'd probably all get sick and die before the 100 years are up. I have no idea how to go about raising giant salamanders. Zorian couldn't help but remember how his first meeting with Silver Lake had gone. If he remembered correctly, he had just been attacked by a particularly large giant brown salamander and had killed it in self-defense. This was the catalyst that had caused Silver Lake to finally reveal herself to him. Back then he had blithely given her the salamander corpse, not even realizing how valuable it was, and Silver Lake, after receiving something so apparently valuable from him, still decided to send him on a bunch of fool's errands without even hearing him out. Let's stop dancing around the issue for a moment, Zorian said, swallowing down his annoyance in favor of actually accomplishing something. This is our offer, the Grey Hunter's egg sack in exchange for a month's worth of instruction in pocket dimension creation. What do you say? Oh. Pocket dimension creation? Silver Lake said contemplatively, tapping her chin with her index finger. So that's what you're after. That's a pretty exotic and high-level skill. Are you sure you're even capable of learning it? Oh, good. She didn't deny she possessed the skill in question. Zorian had kinda been afraid that her hideout was just something she had found through luck and that she wasn't actually capable of creating pocket dimensions herself. It would have been a pain trying to find someone else who had that kind of expertise. In any case, Zorian didn't try to convince Silver Lake with words. Instead, he simply opened a dimensional gateway straight to Koth right then and there. Silver Lake was instantly on guard when he started casting a spell, but didn't try to stop him. About halfway through, she seemed to realize what he was doing and relaxed. Instead, she got an intrigued look on her face, especially when the dimensional passage itself sprang into existence beside Zorian. She circled the gate a few times, peering intently at it, before turning to Zorian again. Well, you are full of surprises. I don't think I've ever seen such a stable, well-crafted dimensional passage, Silver Lake reluctantly admitted. Zorian smiled. That was only natural. After all, Zorian's gate creation skills were a fusion of more orthodox gate creation skills that Svim had taught him, as well as the insights Zorian had made from studying the Abasin permanent gates and seeing the Bakura gates in action. He doubted many people had had the opportunity to study so many different gate creation methods. As you can see, I'm quite good at dimensionalism, Zorian said. And so is my friend Zack, here. You don't have to worry about us not being able to follow your instructions. Well, that's good, Silver Lake said with a wide, happy grin. Then that just leaves the question of payment. You see, I don't think the Grey Hunter's eggs will be enough to pay for this. Zorian didn't bat an eye at this. He'd fully expected Silver Lake to discard their initial offer and reach out for more. Someone as greedy and insatiable as she was would never agree to a person's first offer. It was good then, that he had many more things to offer. I could dispute that, but I am feeling generous today, said Zorian. He motioned for Zack to take out the orb of the first emperor, which he promptly did. What my friend is holding is a portable pocket dimension holding an ancient ruin. It's a lost artifact from the Age of Gods, probably impossible to reproduce in modern times. If you agree to this deal, we will allow you to study the artifact for the duration of our lessons. I'm sure you can imagine how beneficial this could be for your own pocket dimension creation skills. Silver Lake clearly could imagine, because she stared at the orb with such intensity that Zorian was afraid she would attack them both on the spot and try to take it from them. But after a few seconds, she shook her head and tore her eyes away from the orb. Throw in that modified gate spell of yours and we have a deal, Silver Lake said. No, I can't agree to that, said Zorian with fake sadness. Still, that spell isn't completely out of the question if you agree to some additional concessions. Silver Lake scowled at him, but Zorian completely ignored her displeasure. If she could be greedy, so could he. He could tell she really wanted that gate spell, so why not get everything he could out of it? I suppose you have something specific in mind, she asked him. I want to acquire the ability of soul perception, Zorian said. And unfortunately, the potion made out of dirge moth chrysalises is not an option. Yes, that potion doesn't keep well at all, Silver Lake confirmed. It can last 6 months at most, and even that's pushing it. But really, why are you bothering me with such a minor request? Just go kill some people. That's how nearly all necromancers get that ability these days. Even if you have no talent whatsoever at soul magic, you should be able to get it after 20 or so sacrifices. That isn't an option, Zorian said, glaring at her lightly. At all. If I have to ritually murder people to get the ability, I'd rather give up on the idea. Bah. Silver Lake spat. What's a touchy-feely, squeamish kid like you trying to get soul perception for, then? You'll never achieve anything worth a damn in soul magic with that attitude. I may need it to save my life, Zorian told her. It's not something you need to worry about. The question is, can you do it? Can you make me a potion that can grant me soul perception in less than a month's time? Humph, Silver Lake scoffed. Do you even know how difficult it is to acquire soul perception through a mere potion? Yes, Zorian said decisively. I really do. That's why I came to you for help. Truthfully, most of what Zorian knew about that came from Sudamir, who had been extensively interrogated for his knowledge in previous restarts. Alanik contributed some, but the scarred battle priest was cagey about his knowledge of necromancy and outright admitted to be inferior to Sudamir in that regard. Anyway, apparently, all souls had some measure of soul perception in them by default, but it was tightly locked and unavailable for use. Alanik's explanation for this was that soul perception was something the gods intended to be only activated after death, to help guide the soul to its destination, and that its premature activation on the material plane was dangerously tempting. Thus, the gods sealed it away until death, lest it lead people to heresy and sin. Sudamir's explanation was that this ability was something inherent to souls themselves, and that the gods had selfishly sealed it away because they were afraid of humanity's power and ingenuity. Considering necromancers tended to be wildly immoral, Zorian was kind of leaning towards Alanik's side of the argument. It didn't matter, though. Even Alanik admitted that soul perception wasn't evil by itself. The Triumvirate Church urged people not to deliberately seek it out, but at the same time they encouraged its use among their priesthood. Every high-ranking priest and quite a few lower-ranking ones had some measure of soul perception. With the disappearance of the gods, the Triumvirate Church had to find a way to make up for their loss of divinely granted powers, and granting soul perception abilities to their priesthood on a mass scale was one of the methods used. It was the Triumvirate Church who developed and perfected the Dirge Moth Potion, the most affordable and reliable alchemical method of gaining soul perception to date. It was just that the recipe for the potion was so simple and distributed so widely that it eventually leaked outside the church hierarchy and became wildly employed in necromantic circles. Zorian once felt it was strange that a potion only available in 23-year intervals would be so attractive to people, but then he found a fragmentary recipe for an alternative potion in Sudamir's memories and immediately realized why. The ingredients required absolutely couldn't be acquired either in stores or on the black market. These were the sort of things one needed to personally seek out in the wild and dangerous corners of the world, and most of the ingredients came attached to creatures possessing some method of attacking the soul. Even for Zack and Zorian those things were a major danger. In order to make a potion outlined in Sudamir's memories, one would have to possess top-notch connections or a great deal of time to track down all the ingredients, have enough power to claim them, and then find someone with enough alchemical skill to make a complicated potion they had probably never made in their life and succeed on their first try. On top of that, all such potions were based on the same basic principle: they brought the imbiber on the very brink of death, only to pull them back at the very last moment. Very much like that special training Alanik had put him through, only even more extreme. Needless to say, if you made that kind of potion incorrectly, you were highly likely to die on the spot after drinking it. Dirge moths may only come every 23 years, but they were rather abundant when they did show up, thus allowing alchemists to actually practice with the ingredients. Of course, there were other methods of getting soul perception. They just weren't very useful for him. For instance, one could simply be born with it. Some people had innate soul sight, called ghost eyes by the scholars, much like he had been born innately empathic and capable of instinctive mind magic. He obviously wasn't one of these. Some people, after almost dying, unlocked the ability by accident. But this was something that couldn't be counted on, since nobody knew how that really worked. Finally, there was a really simple, accessible method involving a sacrificial ritual. All one needed to do was forge a temporary soul bond with a person and then kill them. Slowly. While keeping them conscious, because of course it wouldn't work otherwise. This was the method Sudamir used, and the method that most budding necromancers used, since it was cheap and easy to set up. Having experienced what the procedure entailed from Sudamir's memories, Zorian knew he didn't have what it took to go through that. He was, as Silverlake said, way too squeamish to basically torture a dozen people to death. If you know how difficult those potions are, then surely you understand that making one of those in a month is nonsense, even for me. Just gathering the ingredients alone. Whatever ingredients you need, we will procure for you, said Zack, cutting her off. You only need to put them together into something that works. Silverlake said, humming to herself thoughtfully. You did kill the Grey Hunter while not damaging its egg sac in the slightest. That speaks well of your combat skills. Still, gathering ingredients for an old-fashioned soul perception potion will require you to have at least elementary soul defenses. We have those, Zack told her. You do? She asked, sounding surprised. Well, fine then. So long as you take care of ingredient collection, I guess I can make you a potion of soul perception. But only that. I will not give you the recipe or allow you to watch the creation process itself. Acceptable, Zorian nodded. He waited for a few seconds, but it did not seem like she would say anything else. So, do we have a deal then? In exchange for the Grey Hunter's eggs, research access to the portable pocket dimension in our possession and my expertise with the gate spell, you agree to teach us pocket dimension creation and make us a potion of soul perception. Silver Lake stood silently, mulling the deal in her head. She frowned and grimaced to herself, occasionally breaking into indecipherable muttering in strange gestures. Zorian watched her suspiciously, worried that she was trying to slip in some stealthy spellcasting in all that nonsense, but it all seemed to be completely innocuous. Well, as innocuous as that kind of unstable behavior could be, anyway. I have a question, she finally said. Zorian motioned her to continue. Earlier, you told me that wild story about this month endlessly repeating itself and how I lose all memory of it while you don't. Wouldn't that mean that everything I gain in this deal is illusionary, while everything you gain from it will actually stay with you? I thought you didn't believe in that, Zorian remarked. Let's pretend I do for a moment, Silver Lake said without batting an eye. Am I wrong? You're not wrong, Zorian shook his head. In the grand scheme of things, this deal heavily favors us. Everything you gain will be gone at the end of this month, while the knowledge we gain and the unlocking of my soul perception will stay with us for future use. Then don't you think it's stupid to tell me that? Silver Lake asked him curiously. She didn't seem to be actually angry, merely interested in the logic he used to arrive to his decision. I mean, I don't actually believe that nonsense you're spouting, but if I did, it would make me totally unwilling to accept this deal of yours. I'm thinking towards the future, Zorian told her calmly. It's not possible for me to absorb your pocket dimension creation skills in less than a month. We both know this. I will be coming over here with this same deal again and again, and I'll need to continue from where we left off in the previous restart. I might be able to fool you at first with lies of having learned the basics from someone else, but that will quickly get untenable. At some point, I will have to explain how I know skills that are obviously yours even though you don't remember teaching me. Well, that's all good, but how does this help you right now? Silver Lake asked expectantly. Right now would be a good time to discover something I can use to convince the future you I am telling the truth, Zorian said. You might not believe me, exactly, but you're clearly willing to entertain the idea for a time as your current line of questioning amply proves. She scowled at him, but he ignored her displeasure. Basically, I am hoping you will eventually tell me something that I can show off to your future self in order to convince her that the time loop is real and we really have met before even if she has no memory of it. Silver Lake stared at him for a moment before breaking into cackling laughter. Zorian sighed. He really didn't see what was so funny about that. Boy, you are madder than I am. She finally wheezed out, punching herself in the chest a couple of times to get her laughing under control. Anyway, I accept your deal. And since I'm in a good mood right now, I'll throw in a reward for you. You want a secret? I'll give you a good one. The reason I need those Grey Hunter's eggs and the body of a 100-year-old giant salamander is because I'm working on a potion of youth. You're trying to stave off death from old age? Zack asked, surprised. Wow. That's an incredibly advanced skill. I heard. From Zorian you were a master alchemist, but I didn't know you were that good. Silly boy, Silver Lake chuckled. I'm not trying to stave off old age. I already have that. They were both struck speechless at the admission. An immortal. Ha ha. Silver Lake cackled. Surprised, aren't you? Yes, I could persist like this indefinitely. Don't get fooled by my dashing good looks, I'm positively ancient. How ancient? Zack asked cautiously. It's impolite to inquire about a lady's age, she said with mock bashfulness. But it's a 3-digit number, I can tell you that much. Anyway, I did a fine job of stopping time from ravaging my body, but this isn't good enough for me. I want my youth back. And with those spider eggs you brought me, I'm only one step away from that goal. A short silence descended on the scene, Zack and Zorian being at a loss what to say about that. Pretty good secret, isn't it? Silver Lake said. She told them all this just so she could brag about how amazing she was, didn't she? Yes, Zorian coughed. Yes, it is. Anyway, about this trade. The eggs stay with us until we meet again, then, Zorian warned her, completely ignoring her banter. Humph, Silver Lake scoffed. Fine, be that way. Paranoid brats. Make sure to stash them in a dry, dark place with plenty of ambient mana around or they'll get ruined and the deal will be off. I'll keep that in mind, Zorian nodded. The eggs were a lot simpler to preserve than he feared, then. Just to make sure, this thing is safe, right? The eggs won't hatch in a few hours and release a bunch of tough little spider monsters everywhere, right? No, well, they shouldn't, Silverlake said, hesitating slightly. We're stashing them well away from any populated areas, Zack said decisively. And when we go to retrieve it, we're sending one of your simulacrums in first. Hey, the simulacrum currently present protested. Stop that, Silverlake snapped at them. It will be fine. Trust me. All three of them gave Silverlake an unamused look, clearly telling her how they felt about her reliability and trustworthiness. Kids these days, no respect for their elders, she muttered angrily. Well, off with you then. Go away. This has been such a pleasant meeting thus far, it's best to end things on a high note. Don't forget to bring gifts the next time we meet. Honestly, I can't believe you two came to visit someone and didn't even bring them a bottle of brandy or something. Don't you know that gift-giving is an important tradition? No, don't answer that, I was just lecturing you, not actually asking you for your opinion. Go. Shoo. And thus their meeting with Silverlake ended with her shooing them away like a bunch of naughty cats loitering around her backyard. Still, they'd largely achieved what they came for, so Zorian was happy. He just hoped she was actually going to keep to her end of the bargain. When Zack and Zorian came to visit Silverlake again, she was standing next to a humble cottage, messily butchering a pair of giant brown salamanders. These were smaller specimens, incomparable to the giant that had tried to eat Zorian so long ago, so Zorian assumed they were not the sort she needed to complete her potion of youth, but apparently she still had some use for even younger salamanders. In any case, she welcomed them with a wide smile and an immediate demand to hand over the spider eggs. They did so, patiently waiting as she ignored them entirely for over a minute in favor of inspecting the eggs for damage and whatever else she was looking for. She ushered them into her cottage, which proved to be less of an actual cottage and more of a disguise for the entrance to her pocket dimension. Well, the inner layer of her pocket dimension. The cottage itself was also hidden in its own pocket dimension, which is why Zorian couldn't find it by just wandering the forest. But the cottage dimension was just the outer layer of her hidden world, one that could be deployed, thereby becoming actually accessible to visitors, and compressed, seemingly disappearing from the world entirely, on a whim. Nested inside this cottage dimension was another, bigger pocket dimension, which served as Silverlake's actual home and base of operations. In Silverlake's own words, the cottage was just a front to fool idiot visitors. As for the contents of the inner layer, it consisted of three things: a nice, luxurious two-story house, an expansive herb garden full of rare magical plants and a heavily warded alchemical workshop where she did most of her work. Yes, a powerful witch that was clearly very proud of her traditions and made distinctions between alchemy and potion-making had a fully equipped alchemical workshop that would be familiar to any conventional alchemist out in the major cities. Zorian couldn't help but find that a little amusing. It had been 5 days since then, and thus far Silverlake was keeping to her side of the deal. Zorian was afraid she would try to shirk her duties as an instructor, giving them inscrutable training regimens that weren't certain to work before disappearing into her workshop for the rest of the day, but this didn't happen. Probably because they were deep inside her home base and there was a real danger that they could torch her home and herb garden if they felt cheated by her. Or maybe because she really wanted the gate spell modifications and knew that the level of cooperation she could expect out of Zack and Zorian in regards to that would directly correlate to the level of dedication she showed when teaching them how to make pocket dimensions. Whatever her reasons, Silver Lake actually gave them long, exhaustive explanations and even created a few fist-sized pocket spaces in front of them as a demonstration. Creating a pocket dimension was deceptively simple. The basic idea was to stretch and fold a chosen volume of space into a miniature spatial bottle and sort of cap it. This cap was called the anchor point, and it prevented the folded space from snapping back into its natural form the moment it was no longer being forced into shape, as space was naturally wont to do. After that, the pocket dimension could be gradually inflated to the maximum size the anchor point could bear. Obviously, the creation of an anchor point was the most important part of pocket dimension creation. It was the place where the dimension was connected to the main reality, and served as both an entrance and as a foundation upon which the stability of the dimension ultimately rested. Its size, power and sophistication determined how big and stable a pocket dimension could be. If it was ever destroyed, the dimension attached to it would quickly meet the same fate. Neither Zack nor Zorian had yet managed to successfully create a stable anchor point, no matter how minor. The process was every bit as hard as learning how to cast the gate spell, except it required even more mana and attention to detail. Zorian was somewhat annoyed to realize that Zack would probably get the grasp of the ability far sooner than he would, simply because he had far more mana to burn on training than Zorian did. It didn't help that Zorian had heavily stunted his ability to recover mana by maintaining 6 different simulacrums. Funny how he invented a brand new method of using simulacrums, having the maintenance cost of each one and then promptly doubled the amount of simulacrums he kept going at any particular time. Currently, Zorian was sitting on the ground in Silver Lake's pocket dimension, reviewing reports from his simulacrums while he waited for his mana reserves to recover. One of the simulacrums was in Koth, brainstorming how to get to the other pieces of the key with Daimen. Another was raiding the Academy Library for restricted theory books on advanced dimensionalism. The third one was arranging a trade deal with one of the minor experts they were approaching for work. The fourth and fifth ones were working on upgrades to the simulacrum's golem frames. Not quite something he'd invest so heavily in normally, but he had little choice. All simulacrums went on a strike until he agreed to permanently station 2 of the copies on that particular task. Finally, the sixth and last simulacrum was working on something very delicate and possibly dangerous: mental enhancements. It was pretty low-key for now. He didn't want an insane copy of him rampaging around, or worse, going after him. Additionally, the simulacrums were still essentially him, which meant they were not at all okay with thoughtlessly risking their minds. Taking into account the possible risks to his own safety, and the disturbing possibility that his own simulacrums might mutiny if he pushed things too far in this direction, Zorian had ordered the last simulacrum to limit himself to self-inflicted illusions for now. Things like figuring out how to block out noise and other distractions, add highlights and reminders to his perception, and so on. It was a very orthodox, very safe subfield of mental enhancements. Because it only modified the caster's senses, not their thoughts and emotions, there was only so much one could mess up, and little of it was unfixable. Human mages had done quite a lot of work in this regard, mostly because they had been trying to make divinations that could display their output though illusions projected on the caster's senses. Of course, Zorian also consulted the various Iranian webs too. The Luminous Advocates and Perfect Phantasm Crafters were the 2 webs most helpful to this project, though he had also received notable help from several otherwise minor webs such as Band of Fog and Dreaming Refuge. "Boy, I told you to keep an eye on that cauldron," Silver Lake snapped at him, breaking him out of his thoughts. "It's going to boil over if you keep daydreaming like that. Quit it. It's unprofessional." "Ugh, Zorian," grunted unhappily, throwing a glance at the huge iron cauldron to his left. Silver Lake did basically rope him into helping her with her alchemy potion making while he recovered. However, it was only supposed to be for 10 minutes and she had only come back now to take over, after at least half an hour had passed. "We never agreed I would be your personal assistant when we made the trade. I should start charging you for these things," Zorian muttered, just loud enough for her to hear him. She pretended he didn't say anything. He raised his voice at her. "What is that cauldron even doing?" If you're going to recruit me in your projects, you should at least tell me what's going on. It's an experiment, Silver Lake said distractedly, too busy cleaning some kind of carrot-like wild root to look him in the eye while speaking. I'm sure you noticed me chopping up those runty salamanders in the last few days. I'm trying to artificially concentrate the salamander's regenerative essence to see if I can create a workable substitute for the 100-year-old salamander that I lack. Probably won't work, but it's worth a try. Regenerative essence? Zorian said, frowning. Is that what the giant salamander is for? Of course, Silver Lake said. They can regrow anything, repair any damage. If you carve them carefully enough, both halves will regrow into fully healthy, functional copies. Useful thing, that. Most healing magic simply enhances and accelerates the body's natural healing abilities, so it doesn't work well on some wounds. The salamander's regenerative essence, if concentrated enough and combined with some other ingredients, it might even turn back the clock and undo the effect of old age. Zorian hummed thoughtfully. Okay, so this was slightly more interesting than he assumed. Still, so why are you doing it like this, doing the procedure under the open sky, in a simple iron cauldron? You have an alchemy workshop that nearly every professional alchemist would be envious of. Why not use it? Shows what you know, Silver Lake said. I'm doing it this way because this is the superior option. It's good enough for the job. Doing this with a complicated alchemical setup wouldn't get stuff done any faster or give better results. It would just inflict wear and tear on delicate equipment and be a nightmare to clean up afterwards. Zorian had nothing to say to that. Her argument did make a lot of sense, after all. They both stayed silent for a while. Eventually Silver Lake finally finished preparing the wild roots and unceremoniously dumped them into the boiling cauldron. She watched the liquid bubble for a few seconds, before nodding sagely to herself and adding a couple of wooden planks to the fire. Do you know what the difference between alchemy and potion making is, boy? Silver Lake asked suddenly, glancing at him with narrowed eyes. Zorian was tempted to tell her that potion making was just a subset of alchemy, but he knew she would consider that a wrong answer. She was asking about potion making in the sense that ancient witches understood it, not in the sense that was currently taught in schools. Potion making focuses on using a cauldron, and nothing else, to make their wares, Zorian said. Yes, Silver Lake agreed. Sounds very foolish, doesn't it? A botched potion can release clouds of poisonous or mutagenic gas, explode in your face or splash all over you and melt your skin. Hell, a correctly made potion can be just as bad. Very often, old witches carried a mark of their minor failures in the form of scars, strange odors and skin diseases from the years of exposure to magical fumes and concoctions. Modern alchemy is so much safer, so much more precise. Why, then, do you think the old witches do things in the way they did? Because it was cheaper, he tried. Close, Silver Lake said. It's because alchemy, in its current form, requires an entire society built to enable it. Somebody has to build all the vials, containers, heaters, and other equipment. Somebody needs to grow, gather and track down the ingredients used in it. Somebody needs to transport and distribute it to those that need it or have the right connections to use it. Somebody needs to guard the workshops full of valuable equipment from thieves and various miscreants. The old witches had access to none of that, so they had to make do with chucking things into a big iron cauldron and eyeballing things. It is, as you said, cheaper. Cheaper in terms of money and also cheaper in terms of social infrastructure needed to support it. I see, Zorian said after a while. These days there are virtually no witches that do not use alchemy in some form, in addition to their traditional cauldron-based skills, Silver Lake continued. The ancient covens would have considered us all heretics, I bet. But the ancient covens have all died out to my knowledge, and that's hardly an accident. Times change. The covens didn't and paid the price for it. Alchemy has its place as does potion making. Don't be so quick to look down on it. You made that entire long-winded speech just to deliver that little lecture at the end of it, didn't you? Zorian huffed in annoyance. You're going to remember it better this way, Silver Lake cackled. She prodded the bubbling liquid in the cauldron with an iron ladle she used to mix it. Well, whatever, I think we can leave this be for a few hours. You recovered yet, boy? I say, you sure take your time with your rest. It's a miracle you got this far with such an awful work ethic. Why, when I was your age, Zorian sighed and got up, doing his best to drown out her moralizing. He sent a quick message through his soul to the simulacrum working on implementing sensory filters, telling it to work quickly. He was going to need those skills as soon as possible. The great wilderness that existed in the north of Altazia was a place that contained many rare and valuable things. Exotic natural resources, interesting locations, magical plants and animals extinct in the south, all of those and more could be located if one was willing to spend time searching for them and was strong enough to survive deep in the untamed mountains and forests. This wasn't because the northern wilderness was particularly blessed in natural resources and magical hotspots, of course, but simply because most of it had never been settled and systematically exploited by human societies. The southern areas had once had these kinds of things as well, but the spread of civilization and rising number of mages had caused many of them to disappear. Mines were depleted, forests chopped down and turned into farmlands, dungeon openings sealed away or turned into carefully regulated mana wells, delicate areas destroyed through war or short-term greed, and dangerous plants and animals deliberately hunted to extinction. After all, nobody wanted to live next to a man-eating magical tiger or a walking tree that periodically planted itself in your field and ruined the crops, no matter how valuable they were to some mage in the neighboring country. Such was the case with the plant that Zack and Zorian were currently after. The soul sizer chrysanthemum, as it was called, was one of the rare entities that ate souls. Since nobody wanted a soul-eating flower growing in their garden or anywhere near them, really the plant rapidly went extinct any time humans moved into an area. Thus, if Zack and Zorian wanted to find one, they had to go to the wild areas untouched by most of humanity. Currently, the two of them were hiding under a globe of invisibility, warily watching a huge black bear amble past them. Though the bear wasn't truly a life-threatening danger to them, they were in no mood to pick a fight with it. It was a resilient monster, and no part of its body was particularly valuable on the general market. Considering they had been trudging through the dense foliage of the great northern forest for most of the day, they really just wanted to find where the soul sizer chrysanthemum was hiding and go home. Thankfully, the bear did not appear to be hunting and paid little attention to its surroundings. It simply walked past them and soon disappeared from sight. Zack dispelled the globe of invisibility that hid them from sight and then cautiously scanned the area for further dangers. Although not as dangerous as the deeper layers of the dungeon and the like, Altazia's northern forests were not a place for the unwary. This deep in the wilderness, there lurked threats that posed a danger even to Zack and Zorian working together, should they be caught by surprise. Gathering all these ingredients on Silver Lake's list is surprisingly hard, Zack said, relaxing slightly upon detecting nothing of note. They're rare, dangerous, or both, and Silver Lake never gave us a single clue where we could find any of them, and yet, the task is still clearly doable, so we can't really complain about being given a completely impossible task. The old witch really has a knack for this stuff. I'm half convinced that most of these are not necessary for the potion at all, Zorian said, sighing lightly. He spent a few seconds reorienting himself and then set off in the northwestern direction. Zack followed him without complaint. She probably added quite a few of these because she personally needs them for something, not because the potion we order demands it. The trouble is, we have no idea which ingredients are essential and which are not, Zack finished for him. She never lets us see the actual recipe. We can only speculate and try to call her bluff, but we're more pressed for time than she is, and she knows it. She wouldn't relent, even if we guessed correctly, and might even up the price out of spite. Yes, Zorian nodded. Whatever. It's doable, that's all that matters. Let her have her little victory if it pleases her. True, Zack agreed. Say, are you really sure we're in the right place? We've been looking for more than 2 hours and the flower doesn't appear to be here. Maybe the Yeti tribe we spoke to lied to us. Relations between them and humans are not exactly the best. But this is so boring, Zack whined childishly. Tough luck, Zorian told him pitilessly. Zack was quiet for a few seconds before he started talking again. You know, the idea of fighting a flower is kind of funny. And embarrassing, he said. I don't know, Zorian said. I think fighting those rabbits a few days back was way more embarrassing. Especially since both of us ended up getting bitten before we managed to bring them down. Ugh. Don't remind me, Zack groused. Those have got to be one of those fake ingredients Silver Lake added to the list. I mean, how are a bunch of rabbits like that related to a potion of soul perception? I think those red gems embedded in their foreheads were some kind of sensors, Zorian speculated. They did see through our every attempt to sneak up on them. The two of them spent the next half an hour discussing which of the ingredients were likely to be fake, only to realize that none of them were obvious imposters. They could all potentially be valid, which meant that either Zorian was too paranoid or Silver Lake was very clever when picking her additions. Zorian was leaning towards the second option. I know we already talked about this before visiting Silver Lake, but are you really sure this is even necessary? Zack eventually asked. Seeing Zorian's confused look, he moved to clarify. Acquiring soul sight, I mean. Are you really sure you need it? Of course I'm not sure, Zorian said, shaking his head. Maybe once we get the whole key, everything will be neatly resolved, and me getting soul sight will end up being a pointless diversion. The thing is, even if the Guardian of the Threshold overlooks the fact there are two of us and places our souls back into our bodies, there is a problem. Your original body still has its old soul, Zack said. Well, it would be more accurate to say that the body I hope to inhabit was never truly mine to begin with, Zorian said. But yes, that's the core issue. If I want out, I need to steal my real-world body somehow. I guess this could be done by convincing the Guardian to switch my soul with that of the original, but the Guardian has made it clear that this goes against the very nature of his job. I'm skeptical that acquiring the key will let us ignore this. I get that, Zack said. But maybe you don't have to literally steal the body, you know. Maybe you can kind of, coexist with your old self. An interesting idea, Zorian said. I don't know enough about soul magic to say if that would be possible, but that kind of thing would still require me to acquire soul perception first. Yeah, I guess, Zack sighed. They walked through the forest in silence for a few seconds, Zorian keeping an eye out for that funny-shaped rock outcropping that the old Yeti had told him about. It should be around here. What's really on your mind? Zorian eventually asked. You know, I'm not really sure that I'm the real controller of this time loop, Zack said. And if I'm not, I could be facing the same choice you are. Ah, Zorian said, nodding. Personally, he felt Zack's fears were unfounded, but he knew by now it was useless to tell him that. I see. Do you think I should try to acquire soul perception too? Zack asked. I'm not nearly as comfortable as you are in killing my old self, but I have to admit if I have to choose between myself and him. It would be the safe thing to do, Zorian told him. Concerns about not being the true controller aside, he didn't see any particular downsides about Zack acquiring soul perception. But best not to try that in this particular restart. We have no idea how the safety triggers on your marker are going to react to a potion like that. I mean, they did terminate the restart when you tried to undergo Alanix training, remember? I remember, Zack scowled. If it weren't for that, I would have had simulacrums of my own by now. Right. They could easily trigger this time too, since the potion works on similar principles, Zorian remarked. It's best if we wait for a less interesting restart before testing this. Yeah, I'm in no hurry, Zack said. He glanced around the area they were traveling in. How long do you think it will take you to find this soul-eating flower? Maybe we should stop for now and come back tomorrow. Actually, Zorian began, his eyes zeroing in on a bunch of seemingly unremarkable trees. We're here. He pointed at the base of one of the trees, where a beautiful white flower proudly sprouted from the forest floor. There was nothing overtly supernatural or sinister about the soul-sizer chrysanthemum. It was a large plant, but not monstrously huge. Its leaves and stalk were the most mundane of green, easily blending into the rest of the nearby vegetation. A single white flower the size of Zorian's head crowned the otherwise unremarkable plant, its numerous rows of petals folded inwards into a sort of flowery hemisphere. This sort of peaceful, unremarkable appearance was merely a trap, though. Since the soul-sizer chrysanthemum was immobile, most of the time it behaved as inconspicuously as possible to lure its victims near. The moment Zack or Zorian stepped close enough, the flower would reveal its true nature. You know how I said earlier that the idea of fighting a flower is kind of funny? Zack asked. Yeah. Zorian prompted. I take it back, Zack said. There is nothing funny about a dangerous creature that hides itself so thoroughly. I looked straight at it and I still can't see any sign of danger. If we hadn't been clued in advance about its true nature and where exactly it can be found, we'd never have noticed it. Zorian hummed in agreement. If you really think about it, this is one of the most dangerous enemies we could possibly face. Stuff like the Grey Hunter could kill us, but the time loop makes that just an inconvenience. But this flower? If we stumbled upon it by accident, without being mentally ready or applying some kind of soul ward beforehand, there is a good chance we'd really end up with our souls devoured by it. Well, you would, Zack pointed out cheekily. The safeguards on my marker would probably kick in the moment my soul was torn away from my body. You, on the other hand, would be thoroughly doomed. You know what soul-devouring entities do, right? They flay the outer layers of the soul for nourishment and keep the indestructible core as a sort of mana battery, Zorian said. Or in the case of wraiths, they use the core to make more of their kind. I don't know how fast this process is, but even if it takes a while, I'd probably end up with my soul severely damaged by the time the restart ended. I would probably spend every single restart thereafter in a deep coma and stay that way until the time loop collapsed. They both stared at the seemingly peaceful flower for about a minute, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Alright, enough dawdling, Zack suddenly said, clapping his hands loudly to wake up Zorian from his reverie. Let's get this thing uprooted and chopped up into ingredients. After discussing it for a few minutes, they decided it would be best if only one of them confronted the chrysanthemum. The other would stay back and be ready to extract them if something went wrong. This, however, led to the issue of who would be staying back and who should advance upon the dangerous plant. The argument was surprisingly charged, with both of them arguing that they should be the ones attacking. Zorian argued that his soul defenses were better than Zack's by far and that they couldn't afford to get into the habit of triggering premature restarts. Zack, on the other hand, argued this was dumb and that he should definitely be the one making the attempt. Zorian might have much better soul defenses, but if they proved to be insufficient, he could wind up permanently dead in all future restarts. In light of that sort of risk, who cares about a single interrupted restart? This is beyond stupid, Zack told him. You don't even like fighting. But I fight when I have to, Zorian countered. Besides, I think you're exaggerating the level of danger I would be in. If you see me slump dead, immediately kill yourself. That will trigger a restart and get my soul out of its stomach. I doubt the chrysanthemum can mutilate my soul in such a short time. Zack scowled at him. Any plan that involves me committing suicide is a bad plan. I swear, I still can't believe you were wearing a bomb around your neck before getting control of your restart trigger. Actually, I still carry a bomb around my neck, Zorian told him, showing Zack the plain-looking golden chain he usually kept tucked into his shirt. His spell formula skills had advanced to such an extent by now that the chain was no longer obviously a magic item unless one specifically decided to inspect it with analytic spells, it would look just like a mundane accessory. Having more contingencies is always useful, after all. Still, I guess you have a point. I don't think I'd fail here, but the worst scenario is worrying. Tell you what, I will agree to back off here, but if you fail and end up cutting the restart short, I get to confront the chrysanthemum the next time around. Deal? Deal, Zack nodded. If I can't do it now, I probably won't be able to do it on the second or third attempts either. I guess it is kind of unreasonable of me to cut restart after restart short like that. I still feel an urge to hit myself when I think of all the restarts I frittered away by doing just that. Then Zack started walking towards the flower, and all their arguments were revealed to have been moot. The soul-sizer chrysanthemum twisted itself to face them both, the flower stalk moving with the speed and fluidity alien to normal plants, and a barely perceptible ripple emanated from it, covering a spherical area easily large enough to cover them both. They had been within its striking range all along. It just chose not to attack them immediately. Fast and omnidirectional, the ethereal ripple released by the chrysanthemum was impossible to dodge. Zorian, caught off guard by the attack, could do nothing except take it head-on. Zack, having expected some kind of response from the flower, had successfully erected a shield around himself before it hit. It didn't matter, though the ripple passed through the shield like it wasn't there at all. It slammed into both of them at almost the same time, sending them reeling. Zorian felt sick in a way he had never experienced before in his life. His vision swam, assailed by numberless fleeting illusions and flashing lights, and his ears felt like a bomb had gone off right next to him. His sense of balance went completely haywire, his skin stung all over and his stomach churned like something was trying to tear itself out of him. It took a monumental act of will not to vomit all over himself and collapse on the ground. It was some kind of stun attack, Zorian realized. An incredibly complex stun attack, weaving together physical, mental and spiritual aspects into one unified whole. Zorian reached into his own mind and forcibly shattered the mental aspect of the stun. The whole structure of the attack immediately became unbalanced, allowing Zorian to stabilize his condition somewhat. His vision cleared up a bit, and he saw Zack collapse to his knees, hands shaking, and vomit all over the forest floor. That wasn't much of a surprise, to be honest. Zack was not as adept as Zorian in defending either his mind or his soul, and he was closer to the chrysanthemum when it attacked. Before Zorian could do anything, the soul-sizer chrysanthemum turned towards him. Perhaps because he had weathered its stun effect better than Zack, or because he was closer to the border of its attack radius and it worried he would flee, but the flower chose to deal with him first. Its multitude of petals erupted with ghostly blue flame and unfolded like a mouth full of teeth, revealing a pitch-black area in the middle of the flower. Zorian's soul immediately started vibrating in his body, sending waves of pain throughout his very being. Normally, this level of soul attack would never be able to seriously threaten Zorian, but with the aftereffect of the stun still lingering, resisting the pull of the flower was proving difficult. And the effect wasn't stopping. Instead, the suction only seemed to get stronger as time went by and the flower searched for a firmer grip on his soul. Despite that, Zorian was not worried. Before it attacked, the flower felt just like any other plant in the forest. It had no discernible mind, and thus nothing that Zorian could target with his mind magic. Now, however, he could very much feel a thinking mind behind the chrysanthemum. He gathered all of his concentration and then launched a massive telepathic attack at the plant's mind. This time, it was the flower's turn to reel back in shock. Its attack on Zorian's soul immediately ceased as it silently shook and waved around, trying to stabilize itself. Zorian wasn't going to let it have the time. Even though he still hadn't entirely recovered from the initial attack, he poured all of his energies into launching one mental attack after another. The flower resisted fiercely. It was clearly a complete amateur when it came to mental combat, but it possessed an instinctive ability to form mental barriers and was armed with a powerful magic resistance that made it difficult and mana expensive for Zorian to target it. After a while, Zack recovered enough to make his own move. He summoned a massive ghostly blade and sent it chopping down at the stem of the plant. In all honesty, it looked like complete overkill, and Zorian worried he was going to ruin the chrysanthemum's value as an alchemical component. They needed it fairly intact, after all. The flower was undaunted, though. Threatened by the incoming blade, it spat a stream of glittering stars out of the black hole in the center of the flower. The glittering motes of light immediately arranged themselves into a dome-like construct that stopped the blade cold with barely a flicker. They were soul cores of creatures the chrysanthemum had devoured in the past, Zorian realized. Somehow, it could control them and shape them into defensive constructs. Well, not just defensive constructs, it turned out. After Zack and Zorian kept hammering its defenses for a while, it realized that at the rate things were going, it was going to lose. Its shield was going to get battered down sooner or later, and Zorian's strategically launched mental attacks were disrupting its attempts to launch further soul attacks at them. Upon realizing this, the chrysanthemum reshaped the soul cores into a series of long, hair-like whips and started flailing them around. Zorian at first thought the chrysanthemum intended to attack them with those, but it turned out he had once again underestimated the plant. It quickly wrapped the whips around the nearby branches and uprooted itself right out of the ground before turning to flee. Zorian had to admit, seeing an uprooted flower swing about from branch to branch, like some kind of weird monkey, was a unique experience. Sadly for the soul-sizer chrysanthemum, such desperate measures would not save it. It launched another stunning pulse at them in an attempt to lose them, and this did slow them down quite a bit, but in the end it was chased down and killed. "We have been outsmarted and nearly killed by a flower," Zack said, still keeping a wary distance from the chrysanthemum's remains. "We are never speaking about this again." Zorian readily agreed to this request. The esoteric order of the Celestial Dragon, known to most people as the Cult of the World Dragon, was more than just a weird religion. It was an entire support organization that helped its members advance forward in life. They vouched for their fellow members when skills and trustworthiness were questioned, they helped them get the jobs and mentorships they needed to advance in their careers, offered their members loans under favorable conditions, granted free access to spell libraries that would be too restricted or expensive for members to otherwise get, and they provided legal aid if members got into trouble with the Mage Guild. The higher ranking one had in the cult, the more pronounced these advantages got. This was the main reason why the cult got so powerful and widespread. The sort of large-scale, highly treasonous plot that the cult was currently participating in was not really something that they usually did. It was actually very, very atypical. For the vast majority of their existence, they had simply been a mystery cult crossed with a mutual aid society, kind of shady and disreputable, but nothing that the authorities would go too crazy over. Their biggest enemy was the Triumvirate Church and their faithful, which considered the cult's beliefs to be a direct affront to their dogma. In any case, an expansive organization like that had more than just direct members of their secret club to draw upon. They also had a multitude of outside associates and other experts that sporadically worked with them. Some of these were true faithful that deliberately maintained distance from the main organization so that outsiders could not easily puzzle out the connections between them, others were just mercenaries that sporadically took missions from the cult, and some simply didn't know who exactly they were working with. Zorian had largely ignored these people during his investigation into the cult's activities, since tracking them all down was an incredibly time-consuming and difficult task. He had better things to do with his time. Then Alanik interrogated Sudamir a bunch of times, and they discovered that the crazy mayor of Nyazov Dveri had detailed knowledge of these people. Sudamir appeared to have gone out of his way to gather as much information about the cult as possible, worried that they might move against him at some point. The relations between him and cult leadership hadn't been the best since they realized he intended to publicly advocate for the legalization of necromancy, something they regarded as lunacy. Zorian still wasn't terribly interested in spending time to investigate all these people. He didn't think that would result in anything substantial. But Alanik was, and he didn't have too many other things vying for his time. Thus, he wholeheartedly threw himself into the investigation, making full use of the time loop to comb through every lead and scrap of evidence Zorian could wrench from Sudamir's mind. And today, that effort seemed to have borne some kind of fruit. Alanik had notified Zack and Zorian that he had uncovered something important and told them to meet him next to an unassuming house in one of Scioria's richer neighborhoods. When they arrived, they found the place cordoned off by the Mage Guild personnel, but they had been notified that the two of them were coming and let them through on Alanik's orders. Once again Zorian wondered just what position Alanik occupied that he could command people like this, but Alanik stubbornly refused to answer such questions and Zorian respected the man's help too much to go prying into his thoughts. "You called, we came," Zack said, waving his hand at Alanik to get his attention. "What do you have for us?" "I don't claim to understand every detail of the situation you have found yourselves in," Alanik said, choosing his words carefully due to the presence of other people in the room, "but I believe you've indicated the name Veyers Boranova is important to you, yes?" Zorian looked at him in shock. "What? What does Veyers have to do with this? Is he here?" Zack asked. It was unmistakably Veyers Boranova. Zack and Zorian stared at the body for nearly half a minute, not saying anything. "He's dead?" Zack asked lamely. "Indeed," Alanik said. "I hear neither of you really got along with him well, so I will not offer you condolences." "So the owner of this house," Zorian began uncertainly. "Jornak Dokakin," Alanik told him. "Yes, this Jornak. Did he kill Veyers?" Zorian asked. "When did this happen?" "He is adamant that he did not kill the boy," Alanik said. "He claims the boy died of unknown causes while sleeping. One day he was fine, if a little surly, and the next day Jornak went into his room to check up on him and found him dead in his bed." I'd normally scoff at that explanation, but the timing. "He died on the first day of the restart, didn't he?" Zack guessed. "Yes," Alanik nodded. "The frost damage and the sheer passage of time make it difficult to tell for certain, but I'm pretty sure this is the same situation like those Urania beneath Scioria and the mercenaries that were found mysteriously dead in their homes." "Doesn't that mean Veyers was soul-killed?" Zack frowned. "He isn't Red Robe." "We can't say that just from this," Zorian said, shaking his head. "We have no idea how exactly he entered the time loop, or what would happen if he left it. For all we know, this could be the natural result of his leaving the time loop." "Ugh," Zack grumbled. "So we found Veyers and yet learned nothing of value. I hate things like this. Jornak has been disinclined to cooperate with us in this regard," Alanik told them. "He refuses to discuss details with me. He is a lawyer, so he is harder to shake up and interrogate than most people I deal with. That's why I told you to come here immediately. If you want to get anything out of him, we need to talk to him now. I'm afraid House Boranova has already heard of the news and is going to descend here sooner or later." Alanik then led them to the second floor of the house, where Jornak was currently under house arrest with a couple of guards posted next to him. When they arrived, they found Jornak pacing around his room like a caged tiger, angry and agitated. He deliberately ignored their entrance, not giving them so much as a glance. Zorian observed the man in the room itself. Jornak was younger than he thought he would be, probably in his mid-20s and with a very handsome, boyish face. He was immaculately dressed in expensive but conservative clothes, and the room he was in seemed to be designed to maximize his image as a cultured, well-read intellectual. The walls were lined with filled-out bookshelves and small works of art laid scattered around the place to give it a bit of artistic flair. Zorian's parents had a similar room back in Siren. Much like them, Jornak had probably never even read most of the books lining the bookshelves. "So, Mr. Dokakin," Alanik began. "I'm back. Don't mind my two helpers here, they're just here as support. Now that you've had a chance to calm down a little, are you willing to discuss things like a civilized person?" Zorian gave Alanik a mildly questioning glance. Was he deliberately pissing the guy off? Jornak did not look calm at all. Alanik did not react to his silent question though, so Zorian simply trusted him to know what he was doing. He supposed that with him here, it hardly mattered whether Jornak wanted to talk or not. Jornak finally deigned to look at them, giving Zack and Zorian a brief, contemptuous glance before dismissing them as unimportant. Your church really likes them young, doesn't it, priest? Jornak said, grimacing at Alanik unhappily. I know my rights, Mr. Zosk. I will not talk to anyone until Mage Guild representatives and my lawyer arrive. Until then, I will patiently wait here, and I'd appreciate it if you stopped wasting my time. Curious that a lawyer would want someone else to defend them, Alanik said. A surgeon would be foolish to try to operate on himself, and a lawyer is ill-advised to represent himself in court, Jornak said dismissively. I would not expect a church dog to understand these things. People like you always think you're above the law, anyway. Alanik hummed, completely unaffected by Jornak's caustic comments. I'll be honest and say I expected as much. Zorian? Zorian did not ask Alanik what he wanted. He already knew. He reached out mentally towards Jornak. The young lawyer actually had rudimentary mental defenses, but this was not something that could stop Zorian. He punched through those defenses as if they were paper and pressed down on the man's mind. Jornak's eyes widened like saucers as he realized what was happening. Answer the questions, Zorian commanded. And no. Jornak protested. This is illegal. I'll damn it. Damn it. Did you kill Veyers? Zorian asked, just to be sure. I didn't kill him. I didn't kill anyone. I already said I just found him dead one day. It's the truth. What was he doing in your home? Zorian asked. That's we were friends, Jornak said, gritting his teeth. A friendship between a 15-year-old boy and a 25-year-old man like you. Alanik commented lightly. Who is it that likes them young, again? You people, Jornak hissed angrily at him. He took a deep breath and forcibly calmed himself down. Look, I promise to tell you the whole story. Just release me from your mental compulsion. It's hard to think with this thing muddying my thoughts. Zorian gave Alanik a questioning glance. Alanik nodded for him to do as Jornak said, apparently willing to give the man a chance. Fair enough. He supposed they could always repeat the procedure if Jornak became uncooperative later on. I'm still keeping an eye on your surface thoughts, Zorian told him as he released the compulsion to make him talk. So don't try to lie to us. I don't have to lie. Jornak snapped at him. This whole thing is just damn it, Veyers. Even when dead, he still makes trouble for me. Yeah, he has that effect on people, Zack said with a sagely nod. Jornak ignored that comment, gathering his thoughts for a moment. Alright, Jornak said. So, I met Veyers almost a year ago when he came to talk to me about his legal options in regards to his situation in his house. I empathized with him then. What happened to him reminded me a little of myself. I too have had my birthright stolen from me. Really? Zack asked curiously. I don't want to talk about it, and I ask you to be merciful and not force me, Jornak said. It has nothing to do with this, and you can find out most of it through public documents. It's not like I've ever hid my grievances, after all. Just give us the short version, Alanik said. Jornak gave him a hateful look, but after glancing at Zorian for a second he decided to humor the scarred battle priest anyway. In short, I was a relative of a small house that went extinct some time ago. Although not a true member of the house, I was the closest thing to a descendant, and I was supposed to inherit their wealth and properties, but then a new claimant suddenly appeared, completely out of nowhere, claiming even closer relations. His proof of his lineage was painfully fake and all the documents obvious forgeries, but he was better connected than me, and in the end, courts assigned everything to him and left me with nothing. I see, Alanik said. And so you saw young Veyers coming to you for help and felt touched by this young man that was seeing his legacy usurped from him by branch members of his house. Yes, precisely, Jornak said. In truth, I couldn't help him much. Formal houses like his own are given a lot of leeway in how they govern themselves internally, and general law is only somewhat applicable to his situation. Still, the boy seemed to appreciate my advice, and the fact that I cared, which not many people around him did, if he was to be believed. "And him coming to live inside your home?" Zorian prompted. "That you know he was expelled from his school?" Jornak said, frowning. "Well, he didn't want to go back to his family after that. After wandering all over the city to cool down, he came over to my house and begged me to house him for a few days. He said he needed a place to hide for a while and think about what to do about things. How could I refuse?" "That's very generous of you, and I mean that sincerely," Zorian said. "But how does that lead to his body being stuffed into your icebox?" "That I didn't know what to do, okay?" Jornak said, becoming agitated. "I just came into his guest room one morning to see why he missed breakfast and found him dead. I didn't know what to do." Despite all his problems, he was still a noble, and House Boranova would never take this lying down. "He died in my home and the wards didn't register any intruder at all. How would I possibly explain this? I empathize with the boy, but I don't want to ruin my life for him. Haven't I suffered enough?" Jornak gritted his teeth and started pulling at his hair in frustration. With a sharp turn, he started pacing around the room again, gesticulating to himself and muttering under his breath. It wasn't an act, as far as Zorian could tell. Jornak had never bothered to reform his mental barriers after Zorian destroyed them, leaving his thoughts completely unguarded. Everything he said was truth as he saw it, and he was honestly panicking and unsure what to do. "I didn't know what else to do," Jornak said, still pacing around the room. "If I took it out of the house to dump somewhere, the trackers hired by House Boranova would find me the moment I stepped out of my house's privacy. Wards. As for destroying it, well, I've never destroyed a body before. I mean, obviously I didn't. How would I know how to do that? So I put the body on ice while trying to think up a solution." They didn't find out much from Jornak after that. Although Zorian personally found the man's choices to be rather questionable, he was ultimately just a man who found a dead teenager in his guest room and panicked. If Jornak hadn't knowingly helped the cult of the World Dragon so many times in the past, Zorian would have even felt sorry for the man. About 15 minutes after Zack and Zorian left Jornak's room, another group of Mage Guild personnel arrived, accompanied by several representatives from Noble House Boranova, and took over the scene. Alanik informed Zack and Zorian that this marked the end of his involvement with the case and thus the end of their ability to examine the house or question the man. It was just as well, though. The restart was coming to a close, so there was not much time for a detailed examination. Additionally, it would have been better if they arrived in the man's house at the start of the restart, before he had a chance to stuff Vair's body in an icebox. And in the next restart, they would do just that. Until then, Zack and Zorian agreed to keep speculation about what this meant about Red Robe to a minimum. Despite numerous issues that had cropped up in their search, in the end Zack and Zorian managed to gather all the ingredients Silver Lake needed, or at least claimed she needed, for a soul perception potion. It took them most of the remaining time to do so, however, and by then the end of the restart was looming close. Thus, they were somewhat anxious as they waited for Silver Lake to finish making the potion. "It should work," Silver Lake told them. "I mean, I've never actually made that specific potion in my life, and the old witch recipe that describes it is not nearly as clear and precise as the modern recipes you two are familiar with, but since it's me making the attempt, it will probably work out fine." Yes, we get it, you're awesome," Zack said with a tired nod. "And don't you forget it," Silver Lake said shamelessly. "It shouldn't take long. Gathering the ingredients is the time-consuming part. The actual potion making could be done in as little as 2 hours. You two go play outside while I work. You can practice your pocket dimension creation skills or something. You have a real gift for finding exceptionally infuriating teachers, Zorian," Zack told him after they got out of Silver Lake's earshot. "Yes, but they tend to be exceptionally capable ones, too," Zorian countered. He took out a small box from his jacket pocket and flipped it upside down, allowing a stream of marbles to pour out of the box and into his waiting palm. A moderately perceptive person would quickly realize that there was no way all these marbles could fit into such a small box. Only 28 marbles. Zack smirked. Amateur. I managed to cram 32 of them inside a box like that. Zorian gave Zack a suspicious look, but it didn't seem like his fellow time traveler was lying about that. Damn it, Zorian grumbled. All those specialized shaping exercises and I still can't advance faster in this field than you do. I have 6 times more mana than you do and you're further hampered by the number of simulacrums you keep around you at all times, Zack said with a careless shrug. It's hard to make up for such a disadvantage. He was right, of course. Truthfully, it was amazing he was able to keep up with Zack's learning rate at all. It still made him feel a little annoyed that he lost their informal competition about who would advance faster in the field of pocket dimension creation. Oh well, there was still time to catch up. They would be chipping away at the topic for quite a few restarts after this, and he was confident he had more patience than Zack did. It ended up taking Silver Lake nearly 4 hours to finish the potion, despite her claim that it could be done in as little as 2 hours. She claimed she had merely been waiting for the concoction to cool down to a comfortable drinking temperature before bringing it over, but Zorian suspected it had more to do with the process being harder than she'd thought it would be rather than anything considerate like that. You should drink the potion soon, Silver Lake told him. The instructions were a little fuzzy about its shelf life and there was a bit of unplanned excitement involved in making it, so I had to add in a little something to forcibly stabilize it. It should retain its potency for about a week, after which there is a small but non-trivial chance it might explode in your face. Best not to take that chance, Unplanned excitement, you say, Zack deadpanned. That doesn't exactly inspire confidence. I'm 97.3% sure it will work as expected, Silver Lake said firmly. There was a small silence as Silver Lake looked at them expectantly, no doubt hoping one of them would ask her why it was 97.3 instead of 99 or something like that. She would be sorely disappointed. They both knew better than to humor her like that. I'm 97.3% sure you pulled that number out of your ass, Zorian told her bluntly. But it doesn't matter. This month is approaching its end and time will soon reset itself. I'm going to drink this right away. Ah yes, the great time reset, Silver Lake said. You're still going on about that, huh? Well, did I ever tell you about? But Zorian wasn't listening anymore. He uncapped the potion bottle Silver Lake handed to him and immediately drank the entire potion. The thick green liquid was bitter as hell, but otherwise unremarkable. For a few seconds, nothing happened. And then he experienced a sensation reminiscent of the soul-stealing move he had experienced when fighting the Soul-Sizer Chrysanthemum and his senses rapidly began to dim. He lost consciousness. When Zorian woke up, he found out 2 days had gone by. They had expected as much, though. According to what they knew, the process of gaining soul perception through this method always took at least a day, and could take as many as 5. Some unfortunate souls, ignorant of this little detail, had been known to die of dehydration after drinking a potion like this in secret. In regards to what had happened while he was unconscious, Zorian had only the fuzziest of recollections. He had periodically regained awareness throughout the process, but it was like trying to remember a dream. He remembered a series of senseless, disjoined images, a sea of suns connected by glowing threads, a massive volcano in the middle of an eruption, a carpet of smoke crawling across desolate lands. Just like his usual dreams, in other words. He put it out of his mind, and focused on the important stuff like whether he had successfully acquired soul sight or not. The answer was that he had. It wasn't as instinctive as Zorian's mind magic, but Zorian had found a sufficient amount of instructions in Sudamir's mind to figure out what he had to do. So long as he poured mana into his soul in very specific ways, he could see the souls of other people. It wasn't really sight as such, so much as a whole new sense that gave him headaches when he tried to process what it was really telling him, but that would improve with time and practice. Overall, Zorian considered the whole thing to be a massive success. The only problem with the whole thing was that he had forgotten to mention to Amaya and Curiel that he would be absent from home for several days, so Zack had to take the brunt of their ire and convince them not to report his disappearance to the police. Now all three were kind of annoyed with him. Currently, Zorian was sort of hiding from them in Silver Lake's pocket dimension. Of course, he did have a valid reason for being there, beside that he was trying to find something that would convince her future self that the time loop is real. Silver Lake did have a penchant for telling him little personal stories from time to time, but it was hard to discern which ones were fake and which ones real, so he doubted that would help him convince her in the future. "Did you know I was considered a dangerous radical in my youth?" Silver Lake asked him. Zorian didn't and told her so. "Oh yes. When I was born, the covens had already been on their last legs. Icosian magic had shown itself to be mostly superior to our own spellcasting traditions. After all, most of our spells are long rituals involving lots of chanting and standing still for hours on end, or relied upon invoking the spirits of the land who are notoriously fickle things. If you ask me, you can never rely on them to aid you when you need them the most. The one thing we had going for us, our potion making, the Icosians simply copied and then improved upon. I saw all this, and I decided to commit a huge heresy. I decided to study Icosian methods in addition to the traditional education I received from my mother. My coven exiled me for it when they found out." "Tragic," Zorian said. "But that wasn't quite what I was looking for. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't really be surprised if I revealed I knew this little tidbit of your past." "No, of course not," Silver Lake said. "I'm sure you could find out that and more if you really decided to investigate my history. If you came to me and started narrating my past, I just think you did your homework before coming to see me." "Right," Zorian nodded. "So I'd really prefer if you gave me something more substantial. Surely you have some kind of private password that you could easily tell me without truly inconveniencing yourself. You can change it immediately after you tell me, so it's not like there is any danger I'll abuse it." "Not during this month, no," Silver Lake scoffed. "But what if you're right? I have no assurance you'll only use such a secret. To convince my future self of your crazy tale, you could use it just as easily to rob her blind." "But you don't believe in the time loop?" Zorian tried. "If I'm going to entertain a stupid hypothetical, I'm not going to do a half-assed job," Silver Lake said, her tone brooking no argument. "But I think I have it. Do you remember how you came in front of my home and made all that racket to draw my attention?" "Of course," Zorian nodded. "It's one of the best moments of this month." Silver Lake took a sudden swipe at him with her bony, withered hand, but Zorian successfully dodged her strike. "Brat. I should refuse to say anything now, but I don't want you pestering me about this further," Silver Lake grumbled. "Anyway, at some point I actually considered the possibility of someone finding my abode and trying to catch my attention. I was thinking of what would be the proper, polite way of doing that, and I realized I would probably have to install some kind of doorbell or something. And that would be kind of incompatible with the whole hidden nature of this place, no?" "Right," Zorian agreed. "So the doorbell would have to be hidden too, accessible only to people who have been told about it in advance." "Exactly," Silver Lake said. "Now, in the end, I just scrapped the whole idea. I didn't want people visiting the place too casually. However, I did implement part of the system before I gave up. There is a stone in this place that emits shrill whistles when a special keystone is activated right outside the entrance to this dimension. These keystones were never actually made, so the whistle stone just sits there, uselessly gathering dust. I guess there is no harm in showing you how to create a matching keystone. And that would convince you there's something funny going on?" Zorian asked. "Well yes, I guess it would," Silver Lake said. "I mean, I never actually made a single keystone, let alone distributed them to people. How could you possibly create one that matches perfectly with the whistle stone in my dimension? If you showed up holding one of those, that would catch my attention for sure." Zorian grinned. He had a feeling their chances of convincing Silver Lake in the future had just dramatically improved. One of the more unexpected things about this restart was that Daimen had made a surprise decision to stay in Scioria for the last few days of the restart. Zorian was not sure what exactly triggered this decision. Perhaps it was because Zorian had asked to borrow his divine artifice mirror for a little research, or because his eldest brother had joined them in exploring the ruined palace inside the orb this time, but he suddenly decided he absolutely must see the invasion that occurs on the night of the summer festival. Zorian thought nothing of it at first. Even when Daimen came to Scioria a few days before the actual day of the invasion, making a mysterious claim that he had something he needed to do, Zorian just dismissed it as him wanting to talk with his old friends or whatever. Then Daimen came to him for help, and Zorian realized he probably should have inquired deeper into what Daimen was doing while back home in Eldamar. No, Daimen, Zorian told him firmly. I am not going to set up a meeting between you and Fortov. Come on, Zorian, this is our family at stake here, Daimen pleaded. Oh, please, Zorian protested. You and Fortov not getting along with each other is not a crisis. That's par for the course in our family. Stop being so melodramatic. Crisis or no, this time loop is perfect for solving things like this, and it will take so little effort, too. Show some compassion for your big brother and do me a favor, eh? Daimen insisted. Haven't I let you borrow my mirror when you asked, despite my better judgment? And let's not forget about that secret room full of treasure that I found in the ruined palace. It would have taken you months to find that without me, if you ever did. Zorian made a sour face. Yes, Daimen was rather more helpful in this restart than he usually was. That secret room in particular, they were still sorting through the contents, but it would seem there were some very nice things hidden there. One of the daggers appeared to be a genuine divine artifact. They had no idea what it did yet, but even if it turned out to be underwhelming, it would be extremely valuable as a research subject and priceless trade good. Look, Zorian said. Using me as a lure so you can basically ambush Fortov out there in the open really doesn't sit well with me. Don't you think that's kind of a jerk thing to do? I thought you hated Fortov. Daimen challenged, raising his eyebrow at him. I don't like him, but this sort of manipulative maneuver doesn't sit well with me, Zorian said. Just go confront him directly, okay? I'm sure he'll relent if you keep pestering him. No, he won't, Daimen said slowly. Do you think I'd suggest this if that worked? Besides, you're looking at this the wrong way. You don't have to trick him or anything. You said he always seeks you out at the end of the restart, so long as you don't avoid him. Something about the cure for the purple creeper rash, yes? Yes, Zorian reluctantly admitted. So you want me to just go somewhere where he can easily reach and wait for him to show up on his own? Yes, Daimen nodded. Since you haven't asked him to meet with you, he has no right to complain when it turns out I was in the vicinity. Well, all right, Zorian sighed. Though if you have been pestering him these past few days, he might decide to deviate from his usual pattern. It's amazing as it is that he always ends up pushing Ivory into that purple creeper patch. That has got to be a deliberate move on his part. Daimen agreed. I should ask about that too, I guess. The final plan was very simple. Zorian would spend the evening walking around the city, occasionally casting divinations to see if Fortov was approaching. If he was, he would quickly seek shelter in one of the many coffee shops scattered around Scioria, under the theory that Fortov was slightly less likely to start yelling at Daimen in the middle of a crowded coffee shop than in the middle of the street or whatever. Once Fortov sat down, Daimen would show up to crash the event. Daimen's little plot worked perfectly. Fortov did show up, looking for Zorian's help in procuring an anti-rash potion. Zorian had already made the necessary salve before coming here, so he just handed the little jar full of salve to Fortov and sat back to finish the cup of tea he ordered. Fortov looked down at the cure jar in his hand, fingering it awkwardly, and frowned at him. You just happen to have that very specific cure lying around in your pocket? Fortov asked Zorian incredulously. What the hell, Zorian? Do you carry a whole apothecary with you at all times or something? Well, the way his pocket dimension creation skills were advancing, that might actually be a possibility in the future. I knew you'd be looking for that, Zorian said. I spoke to Ivory, after all. Fortov's face twisted in surprise. She spoke to you, he asked, shocked. Oh man, why me? Look, I thank you for this, but... You pushed her into that purple creeper patch deliberately, didn't you? Zorian said, not really asking so much as making an observation. It's not that simple, okay? Fortov said defensively. You don't know what she's like. I know she looks quiet and all, but she was being really aggressive and wouldn't take no for an answer, and she kept trying to kiss me, and I guess I went a little overboard. And a purple creeper patch just happened to be nearby? Zorian asked. Fortov's explanation was great and all, but how did that explain Ivory ending up in that bush every single time? I deliberately took the purple creeper-related task when they were distributing class assignments, because people usually avoid them like a plague. But that didn't deter her this time. I guess in retrospect it would have been smarter to take something where lots of other people would be nearby. At least that would stop her from trying to get physical with me. Zorian was going to inquire more about this, but this was the moment that Daimen finally showed up to crash the meeting. Strange, he actually kind of wished Daimen had taken longer to arrive. The story was just getting interesting. You again. Fortov hissed, giving Daimen an angry glare. Why can't you take the hint? And how the hell are you even here? I thought you were supposed to be in Koth. Please, I just wanted to talk, okay? Why are you being so? Zorian leaned back in his chair, taking another sip of his tea, and mentally toned down the volume of the shouting going around him. So much for the idea that Fortov would hold back because they were in a public location. But it didn't matter because this was Damon's stage now and there was no need for him to get involved. Well, there wasn't any need for it until both of them decided to pull him into their argument just because he was there. And because his smug attitude pissed them off, apparently. Sometimes he just couldn't win.